Some witnesses give you everything: names, faces, timelines that fit like cogs. Some give you nothing, and once in a while, one gives you music. Tonight on Somnolent Conspiracies, we stay with pure detection. No ghosts, no fate, only what a room can tell and what a trained ear won't miss. The crime was a close-range shooting in a rehearsal studio off the canal, glass wool on the walls and a grand piano under a dust cover. The victim, a concert promoter with too many enemies and one schedule that could choke a pocket diary. The cameras were pointed inward to keep bootlegs out. The hallway lens was down for maintenance. The one person who saw the killer's back as it slipped through the fire door was a teenage pianist warming up in the adjacent room. After the shot, after the running feet, after the silence that always overcorrects, she couldn't speak. The shock closed her throat and left her hands. She sat at the piano and played 12 notes. Not a tune you'd hum, not a motif you'd mistake for pop. 12 distinct pitch classes, no repeats. A tone row. She recorded it on her phone, saved it as statement, and handed it to the first uniform on scene without lifting her eyes. Our detective has worked robberies where the carpet told you the size of a shoe, arsons where the blister told you where the match stood. But a testimony in music? That's new. We'll translate intervals into numbers, numbers into lockers, lockers into the kind of mistakes criminals make when they think no one is listening at the right frequency. We'll test the row against chance, against fashion, against the habits of a frightened prodigy, and we'll see whether 12 pitches can carry a point of law. If you're ready, tune to Concert A. We're about to ask a melody what it saw. Canal Yard Studios hid behind a row of shuttered canal cafes. The kind of place that looked empty even when it wasn't. Detective Maya Hart stepped out of the unmarked into the kind of cold that felt like a room had exhaled. The studios had been patched together from an old warehouse and it showed. Corrugated siding, a new steel fire stair bolted to old brick, a hand-painted sign that tried to soften the utility, Canal Yard, in script. It didn't work. The building gave off procedure. Uniforms had strung tape between a bike rack and a cargo bollard. A cluster of freeloading night air, fog, maybe, hung low along the canal. Hart ducked under, flashed her badge at the cordon, and followed a patrolman whose boots knew the cracks in the concrete. He pointed at the side door as if it had already confessed. "Wedge in the fire door," he said. "Camera down in the corridor. One shot. Promoter." His voice tried for blankness and missed. Promoter. The word carried friction. People owed them or wanted to. She didn't look at the patrolman again. She looked at hinges, at scuffs. The fire doors push bar-bore half-moons of fine metal scraping along the latch face. A hand-sized magnet would ride it that way. On the ground, someone had nudged a rubber wedge with the toe of a shoe to show it to her without touching it. Hart crouched, looked at the wedge from friendly angles and then its back. The part whoever placed it forgot had a back. A faint smear along the taper. Graphite black, oily. Glove transfer with shop grit. She logged it on her phone and looked up. "Ward?" she called, not waiting for permission to be heard. "You on the breaker log?" Sergeant Ward appeared in the doorway with a clipboard and an expression he kept for when things were not yet a disaster. Power tripped at 2117. Subpanel covers were closed. Building manager showed me. EMS sets time of death between 2114 and 2118. He paused long enough to let the coincidence finish itself. "We think something overloaded or someone wanted the dark." "Grabline cameras?" Hart asked. "Interior corridor lens was down for maintenance." Timestamped earlier today. "The studio cams are pointed in, not out. No hallway eyes." She didn't nod. She stepped inside and the sound changed. Studios swallowed footsteps in felt and foam and heavy doors. The corridor smelled like coffee cooled in paper cups, old sweat in cotton, the faint sweet of rosin that had been in a room nearby. The homicide room was halfway down. A door propped open by an evidence tent, and a pair of latex gloves someone had snapped on too hard and left behind. Hart hovered at the threshold, fixed the geometry first. Glass wool panels on the walls. A grand piano under a fitted dust cover that could have been a winter coat draped over something tall. The promoter lay on his side beside the piano bench, neck turned in the manner of a doll. The entry wound showed a clean coin behind his left ear. The exit had flattened into the acoustic foam at a shallow angle. The foam swallowed the bullet the way foam swallows corners. No casing glinted anywhere. Hart's eyes moved to where one would expect the brass to land if there had been brass, and then away again because there was nothing to see. A brass catcher would do that, mesh frame at the ejection port, a little bag to keep the room polite. Daniel Kincaid, Ward said, reading off the clipboard but not really needing to. 43. Concert promoter. Booked the school night tours that sell anyway. Hart looked at Kincaid without ideas. The expensive shoes that let you run when you need to. The watch with a face so black it ate light. One cuff was stiff with a smear that had not yet completely found the carpet. The studio clock over the door had frozen. Hart craned her neck to read it. 21:17. On the other side of the glass, a small control room with a mixing desk sat empty, monitors asleep. Someone had put their hand on the desk and left a warm print that had long since cooled. She took in the space. A thin line of dust along the baseboard under the air vent, undisturbed. The mic stands as left, splayed like cranes. The piano's dust cover pulled partway back at one corner. That last detail fixed her. "Who touched the cover?" she asked. Ward shrugged toward a tech who had the good sense to look irritated at being pointed to. "We did not," the tech said. "We photographed that corner up. We saw the lift and backed off." Hart walked the room without stepping anywhere. She let her eyes do it. The cover's pulled edge fuzzed a bit, fibers bent with a crispness that said minutes, not hours. Whoever had lifted it had done so with purpose and in a hurry. She made the note. Face cloth lifted at treble corner. Then she made another. No smears on the cloth itself. Nitrile gloves. She asked the question that seemed misfit and would not be later. Who else was here at the time? Ward looked at his list. Students in the upstairs rooms. A drum clinic that let out at 2100. Staff, receptionist, one tech in the small room down the hall. One teenager in Studio B, adjacent. Piano practice. She's the one who called. Well, she didn't. The tech went for her when he heard a shot and feet. She couldn't talk. Shock, maybe. She sent him a voice memo file. She named it Statement. Hart took that in the way a swimmer takes in a mouthful and doesn't let it look like choking. Where is she? Ward pointed down the corridor. Studio B, Alice Rowan. 16. Hart left the crime scene to the tented triangles and the steadier hands. She kept her hands in view as she opened Studio B, as if the room needed the same courtesy as a dog you didn't want to startle. This room had a small upright instead of a grand. The smell here was wood polish and the faintness that follows crying. A teenage girl sat on the piano bench with her ankles crossed and the concentration of someone who had learned to still herself because it would please adults. The bench had not been moved since she sat. The phone on top of the piano was unlocked to a voice memo screen. The file read, Statement. The waveform looked like little mountains. Alice, Hart said carefully. I'm Detective Hart. I won't ask you to talk if you can't. I will ask you to listen. Is this your voice memo? Alice nodded once. Her eyes were like the unlit side of a lake. She didn't look at the phone. She looked at Hart's mouth, as if reading its shapes. The recital of a life's practice had been interrupted and a different practice had taken its place. Did you see anything? Hart asked, and lifted her own hand to show open fingers, then pointed to her eyes and then back to the corridor, a crude charade. Alice did not flinch. She lifted her right hand, ghosted it above the keys, and with the left tapped the phone, sent the waveform back to the beginning, and pressed play. It wasn't a tune. Hart had listened to enough music in kitchens while writing reports to know when something wanted to be liked. This didn't. The notes came single file all the way from one end of the scale to the other and back again without repeating the class. Hart had read about 12-tone rows in some book she bought to fall asleep to, Schoenberg or his friends. Music that refused beggary. Here, the refusal felt like testimony. Alice had played them flat and dry with 3 touches that were not like the others, small emphases you could miss if you were scrolling your phone while listening and which no one here was. Alice watched Hart as the 12 finished. Then she hit play again. Same notes, same accents, same stillness in her shoulders. On the third repetition, something in Hart that like ladders made a diagram in the air. 12 pitches. 3 of them pushed a hair. If you were superstitious about numbers, you might call that meaning. Hart was not superstitious about numbers. She was superstitious about rooms. "Ward," she said, without leaving the doorway. Ward came in 2 steps and stopped where foam began. Hart angled the phone so he could read it too. "Do not copy that to your phone," she said, and then realized she sounded like someone's mother. "We'll do this properly. I'm putting the instrument, the bench, and the handset under chain of custody." She stepped back into the corridor and raised her voice just enough that the nearest tech would hear and the farthest wouldn't. "CSI, I need a clean case for an upright piano bench, one for a personal electronic device, and a dust cover evidence bag." The Grand in A was touched. "Document pull at treble corner. We will print the bench legs and the keys if they'll take it. Gloves for anyone who breathes near it." "Keys won't hold," the tech said, reflexive. "Then we'll at least respect them," Hart said. "And get me the subpanel log. I want timings pinned to the minute." She turned back to Alice. "Alice," she said again, and waited until the girl looked at her mouth again. "I am going to take your phone. We'll give you a receipt. We will not read anything else on it. We will make a copy of this file and then seal the original. You did the right thing when you recorded and titled it." Alice's jaw set in a sneer of pain that wasn't directed at anyone in the room. She reached up, pulled a white tissue from the box someone had placed near the metronome, and placed it on the phone as if to make it less itself. Hart slid the tissue aside with a gloved hand and lifted the device into an evidence bag that crackled like winter. She printed the label herself and initialed across the seam so no one would think it had been opened without her. The EMS team brushed past the door with the rhythm of people who have ended their useful minutes. One of them, a woman with gray hair in a rubber band, looked at Hart as if to ask whether the job was any easier in homicide than on the bus. Hart didn't translate it. "Who found the wedge?" she asked Ward, because the details were a river and you had to swim it in an order. "Sound tech named René Duval," Ward said. "He says he heard the shot like a book falling, then running feet, then the fire door thumped and did an alarm. He went to the door, saw the wedge, kicked it clear out of stupid instinct, then realized. He didn't touch it after. We bagged the wedge, he says he moved. The corridor camera should have caught it, but we covered that." Hart filed René Duval beside the wedge, moved what he shouldn't, then remembered himself. It was how people behaved around alarms. They were either musicians of the reflex or they weren't. She went back into Studio A. Kincaid's watch had stopped too, or it hadn't been wound. It didn't matter. The room had more clocks than it knew. Hart towed a chalk line of her own inside her head and held it to the details like a carpenter. She looked once more at the corner of the dust cover, the little lift where a gloved hand had wanted to see if the piano could be made to say yes. Then she looked at the foam where the bullet should be. The acoustic panels showed a disruption that would document nicely under raking light. She told the tech to bring the light. The foam would give up its coin without drama. Outside, the canal trucked its slow ribbon along. Cane lights from the far bank made studded jewelry in the water. Hart realized she was listening to the room the way a person listens to an automatic pencil she's about to use. Dr. Price. She needed a musicologist whose living did not depend on sounding clever. She needed someone who could tell her whether 12 notes could mean more than the shape of their refusal. She pulled out her phone, the one with the case scratched to anonymity, and scrolled to a number saved under H. Helena Price, because they had met once at a talk on forensic listening in a college basement where the coffee had been bad but the conversation had not. Price answered on the second buzz with a whisper that suggested a concert hall and an intermission. "Maya? If this is a social call, your timing is Wagnerian. It's a call about a statement that isn't words," Hart said. "Teenage pianist witnessed a back and gave us music. 12 notes, no repeats, 3 accents. I need to know whether this is art or aim." Price made the kind of sound professors make when they're offered a puzzle that flatters them. "You have the file?" "I will," Hart said, looking at the bag with Alice's phone sealed inside like a ship in a bottle. We'll make a forensic copy in the lab. I want you on record, Helena. Tonight, if you can bear the commute. Price exhaled a laugh that people who teach use when they let you know they will indulge you. Send me the chain of custody log as soon as you have it. I'll hear the row on speakers that don't lie. And Maya, 12 notes without repeats? If it's what you say, the girl didn't just play a thing. She pointed. Hart ended the call with a yes that didn't say yes. She stepped back into the corridor where the evidence bags and the people and the cold from the fire door fought for the same square meter. Ward, she said, we're bringing in a musicologist. Preserve that bench. Bag the dust cover. The wedge, the magnet scoring, the corridor carpet for filings, everything rides on a chain number. And have the lab ready to image the phone. I want the original sealed with my initials and yours. No copies outside evidence. Ward grunted and went off to make it true. Hart stood in the middle of the corridor a second longer than looked productive and let the building's breathing settle. The ducts low, the far rooms click, the uneven drip somewhere in a pipe. A room without echoes could still tell you where the corners were. In Studio B, Alice had placed her hands in her lap to keep them from speaking to themselves. In Studio A, Kincaid lay next to a piano that had been asked a question and might yet answer. Hart drew a line from the wedge to the magnet scrapes to the frozen clock to the upright bench to the file named like testimony. The line wasn't straight. No honest line ever is on the first night. Okay, she said to the room softly, not to be heard by anyone with a pen. We'll listen. The lab at Major Crimes had the look of a studio that had been taught manners. Sound traps and diffusion panels lined one wall, but the lights were police white and the air smelled faintly of isopropyl and toner. On a bench under a plexiglass shield, a gray box hummed while it pulled a bit-for-bit image from Alice Rowan's phone. The original sat in a tamper-evident bag with Hart's initials slashed across the seam and Ward's counter-signature like a witness. Dr. Helena Price arrived in an overcoat the color of stage curtains and a scarf that had decided to be louder than it needed to be. She signed the visitor log without reading it because professors read everything except the things they sign every day and let the scarf unspool into something manageable. You have the memo? She asked, looking past Hart to the technician, who raised a hand to show he had heard. We have the image, Hart said. You'll work from the forensic copy. Headphones are clean, monitors flat, as we can make them on this budget. And Helena, everything you say is on record. Price smiled like a person who had sat on enough panels to be immune. When is anything I say not? The technician slid a drive into a bay, clicked through a menu, and called up the file. The waveform that appeared looked exactly like it had in the rehearsal room. 12 even humps, 3 with shoulders a hair higher. Price pulled the headphones on with an intimacy that suggested this would not be the first time she put her ear where others put their doubts. She listened twice, still as a statue, and then a third time with her eyes closed and one finger tapping against her knee at a steady pulse. 12 pitch classes, non-repeating, she said, removing the headphones but not the focus. Prime row, untransposed from her instrument, at least in this file. Your witness did not noodle. She testified. Explain it as if I'm a jury that wants to be persuaded, Hart said. Price took the invitation and the whiteboard marker Ward handed her. She drew a clock face with 12 ticks and labeled them C through B. In the 12-tone tradition, you can think of a row as an ordering of the 12 pitch classes, C, C sharp, and so on up to B, without repetition. This girl used each exactly once. That alone isn't impossible for the untrained. But two things make me say deliberate: contour and emphasis. She flipped the marker in her fingers. Contour, the shape of the intervals. Here, she made dots around the clock. You have a tritone leap, then a minor third, then another tritone symmetrical around that third. It's conspicuous. Not, I learned it from a pop chorus. Not my fingers happened to fall this way. It's design. Emphasis. She accents 3 positions consistently, on the second note, the 7th, and the 11th. Same dynamic bumps each repetition in your file. Could she have done it by mistake and then repeated the mistake? Hart asked. Unlikely, Price said. I'll quantify unlikely for you later, but for now, your witness knows a row when she wants one. You said she's 16? If she studies with anyone who has opinions about mid-century repertoire, this is well within her grasp. Ward, who had taken a stool in the corner and was pretending to be furniture, raised a pen. What about the tempo? She stays around 80-something beats per minute. Price nodded. 84 by my tap. That looks like nervous system settling at a rate she can stand. But it also gives us a clock if we need one. We can convert durations to absolute times if we have to argue she encoded a window. It's not my first guess, but I'm keeping it alive. Hart leaned against the console, careful not to touch anything the lab would later accuse her of touching. I need more than she can do it, Helena. I need a path from this artifact to the door outside the studio. Price twirled the marker once more and wrote 3 short labels on the board. Digits, intervals, dynamics. 3 plausible cipher layers, she said. 1, pitch class to digit, assign C to 0, C sharp to 1, and so on up to B as 11. That gives you numbers. Because she stressed 3 notes, we can treat those as separators and group the stream into blocks. 2, intervals between successive notes, count semitone steps and map 1 to A, 2 to B, up to 26 as Z, modulo if needed. That gives you letters. 3, dynamics. Your accented notes fall in patterns. Short, short, long, 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 short, long, short. If she was thinking Morse, we might read those as U, M, and R, or as something else if we anchor them differently. I'm not ready to canonize that reading, but it's not ridiculous. Ward looked up. UMR. Urban Map Reference, Hart said, and watched Ward digest the meaningless words as if they were food. She turned back to Price. Before we chase our tails, I want to hear her play it again. Here, under control, to establish repeatability and to rule out any editing trick in the memo. Price's gaze sharpened. Bring her in then, but do it gently. If she's in shock with selective mutism, pressure will just turn the tap off harder. Alice Rowan had been sitting in an interview room with a blanket around her shoulders, looking not so much frightened as present in a smaller radius than before. Hart cleared the room of everyone not necessary and led Alice to the lab's piano. A digital with weighted keys the department used for audio comparisons and, once, a drunken Christmas party that had led to a memo. Hart sat where Alice could see her mouth and let Price conduct. Alice, Price said, her voice a careful mezzo piano. If you can, please play the notes from your recording, exactly as you did. We'll record. If you can't, shake your head and we'll stop. Alice did not shake her head. She took the bench like a seat in a lifeboat. Her right hand hovered above middle C and then began, single notes spare, as if she were choosing words in a language she didn't own yet. Hart watched the meters on the console. The transients came in clean, the same 3 a little higher. Price nodded in time, penning marks at positions 2, 7, and 11 without looking down. When Alice finished, Price said, again, in a different place on the keyboard, same spaces between. Think of it as the same steps, not the same letters. She moved her hand to show higher without touching the keys. Alice nodded and began again, this time starting farther right. The register brightened, but the skeleton unchanged. The spaces between notes, the intervals, matched the first take. The accents fell where Price had drawn her tiny hatch marks. Hart didn't smile, but something in her scalp loosened. The recording tech stopped the capture and normalized the takes. Price overlaid the velocity curves of both performances. The 3 spikes lined up like appointment slots. Repeatable, Price said. Within human tolerance, identical order and accent pattern. That's enough for a methodology section. Hart felt the room regaining gravity. Okay, run your first cipher pass. Price turned back to the whiteboard. Pitch classes to digits. C equals 0, C sharp 1, D2. She wrote the mapping around the clock face. Now read the row. She wrote down the numeric sequence as the technician called pitches off the screen. After the first accent, she drew a slash. After the second, another. After the third, a third slash. Then she frowned at the length of the last fragment and collapsed 2 slashes into one. No better. Treat the second and third accents as a pair, a delineation of a small block. She stepped back. A group of 6 digits, a slash, then 3 digits. 6 plus 3, Ward said, leaning forward. Locker plus line? Like those parcel banks at the station. Price shrugged a philosopher's shrug. Many systems love 6s and 3s, but your city's parcel lockers do use 6-digit IDs. If your detective wants to test it, do it with a warrant and a list of opens around the time your man died. Hart had already texted records for a contact in transit. She felt the case move one ratchet. Intervals next, she said. Price nodded, wrote the semitone distances between successive notes, then converted them at =1 and so on. Normalized to within the alphabet, mod 26 to get letters if a step exceeds. She read the first 5 letters aloud. A, D, L, E, R. She stopped, and for a moment let the silence have its say. Carl Adler? You have a person with that name in your book. Carl Adler was Kincaid's former sound engineer, Hart said. Fired last month after a dispute over safety protocols. He owns a small shop, Adler Acoustics. He will now say that the entire universe is coincidence. Price capped the marker. Coincidence is a reasonable person's defense against pattern seeking, but it tends not to survive convergence. You now have a numeric block that looks like a locker and an interval-based name that points to someone in your circle. Add your dynamics hypothesis and tempo as timing, and you'll be past anecdotals. Hart looked at Alice. The girl had not moved, but the blanket around her had slid a little, as if the room's warmth had finally registered. Hart said the necessary thing. Alice, you've helped more than you know. We'll have someone sit with you now. You don't have to play again tonight. Alice's eyes flicked to the screen and back, and she nodded once, as if acknowledging that a message had been sent and received in the right language. Out in the corridor, Hart let herself exhale once, hard enough to push the stale lab smell out of her head. She called transit, asked for the logs of parcel locker opens at Hauptbahnhof within 24 hours around 2100 hours. While she waited for the email that would either be a blank or a key, she told Ward to check procurement databases for rare earth magnets and consumer-grade jammers within the last month. She told the tech to print velocity graphs and annotate positions 2, 7, and 11. She told herself not to believe in rows that name names until a metal door somewhere yielded to a warrant. Price wiped her hands with a cheap lab wipe and smiled at Hart with a little of the glow of a solved crossword. If this works, she said, you'll have the first case where a tone row testified as to fact. If this works, Hart said, it'll be because a teenager saw a back, and her brain picked a code she could trust more than her throat. The email pinged. Hart opened it. A list of locker IDs scrolled by. One 6-digit sequence had not yet been collected. It sat under line 3, paid in cash. Hart felt the next ratchet click. Helena, she said, bring your scarf. We're going to the station. Hauptbahnhof gave them the Pelican case and a useful sense of progress, but the city's music business gave them everyone else. Hart moved the investigation in 2 lines at once. The line that began at a locker door and the one that began in a promoter's contact list. Daniel Kincaid's calendar read like a taxonomy of favors and weather fronts. Half his week was calls with managers, the other half with people who called themselves managers. He'd brokered rooms, power, and the delicate logistics of other people's egos. You do that long enough, you generate a wake. Marco Bell's office looked like it had been designed by someone who had spent a lot of time being kept waiting in better offices. Chrome, black glass, the air of having paid too much for quiet. Bell rose from behind a desk that would have been a runway if you cleared the papers. He was 40, built like a man who had found a gym that made him comfortable and staff who wrote down the weights. Detective, he said, I heard about Daniel. Terrible. You fought last month, Hart said. No preface. The room would eat it. We disagreed about the Scandinavian bloc, Bell said, folding himself into a smile. He undercut me on an arena hold. I told him it was a small town and he shouldn't do that in a small town. He told me the town was big enough for both of us if I lowered my margins. Any threats? Hart asked. Do you mean the colorful language of men who move trucks? Bell asked. Yes. Did I threaten to put a bullet behind his ear? No, I lacked the poetry. You were where between 2100 and 2200 last night? Hart asked. Opening night at the Lido, Bell said, and slid 2 glossy invites across the desk like proof of a life. 2 acts, one from Lyon, one from Berlin, both of whom I would like very much not to lose in the next week. Plenty of eyes on me. Videos if you enjoy those. Hart had a uniform verify his presence, his wristband, his habit of stepping side stage to be seen. The alibi would probably hold. Bell offered condolences without offering anything else. She let him. Janice Cole met her at a cafe that had once been a locksmith. He wore a coat that looked secondhand and a smile that looked first. Cole brokered debt and its relief. He called himself a consultant because there were no consultants' unions. He stirred his coffee as if it owed him. Kincaid owed you, Hart said, after the waitress left earshot. Kincaid owed everyone, Cole said. That's how you keep motion in a market. But if you're asking whether his balance with me was existential, no. We had a plan. He would sell a block on an upcoming festival. I would get my taste. The world could continue. Did he pay? Hart asked. Part, Cole said. You know how it is. Promoter money comes in clumps and never when you think. He was good for it. Or would have been. He watched her face with professional detachment. You think I shot him to collect? Detective, I have men for unpleasantness. None of them would risk the hallway of a studio and an uncollected locker at the station. That's amateur theater. Where were you? Hart asked. Dinner on Weaver's Row. Ask the owner. He knows my face and unfortunately the volume of my laugh. Cole's phone lay screen down, the kind of courtesy people extend when they want you to notice they are being courteous. If you want a name I can say without prejudice, Carl Adler didn't like Daniel. Said he cut corners. Said Daniel's people wanted the look of safety without the expense. Adler said that to you? Hart asked. To anyone who would listen, Cole said. He's a man who believes he is the smartest in any room and is offended when the room disagrees. He would borrow a magnet for the moral of it. Hart left them both in her notes. Bell for rivalry, Cole for leverage. Rivals kill for position. Fixers don't like mess. Neither fit the Pelican case that waited at property like an answer that would only answer if you asked it in the right order. Back at Canal Yard, the physical thread continued to offer itself to the kind of attention that didn't blink. The fire door latch told the same story as earlier, but the lab's photographs under raking light made the magnet scoring undeniable. Fine parallel abrasions where a plate had been pulled along the latch face, polished arcs where a field had grabbed. The rubber wedge had given up a fingerprint in negative, a smear of shop graphite and a grit that the trace unit matched to a generic bench grinder compound. Not enough to name a workshop, but enough to say the wedge had shared a pocket with a tool. The building's power log, pulled from a cheap submeter that had been installed by a landlord with a biblical distrust of tenants, showed a dip and spike at 2117. The lab could mimic the signature with a portable jammer that hunted the wrong frequency near a relay, but the better match came from a stack of LED work lights slammed on at once. Either way, the point was the trip and the timing. Somebody planned for darkness briefly and knew what it would take in that breaker panel to make it. The corridor carpet gave up filings the color of old brass, caught along the warp like glitter after a show. The SEM images gave them shape. Spiraled edges, slightly flattened where they had been trod. Brass catcher mesh sheds that kind of dust when it rubs against itself in a hurry, when things are folded and tucked. The tech held the photo up as if it were a baby scrambled by a hospital mix-up. It's not unique, he said, but it's the right dirt. Kincaid's call log had 4 missed calls from a number saved as Adler, one answered and cut short the week before. His email contained a brief volley. Kincaid telling Adler he was off the job. Adler replying with a paragraph about the union and standards and reputations, the kind of letter that begins with, for the record, and ends with, you will not like where this goes. It was not enough to establish motive, but it was enough to put adhesive on the name. Hart took a walk through with Rene Duval, the sound tech whose foot had liberated the wedge. He was all wrists and apology. I heard the shot, he said, standing in the corridor and pointing to nothing in particular. I thought it was a book falling, something heavy on the bench. Then I heard feet. One set, fast. the sole pattern hitting the seam in the vinyl like. He stopped. I heard it. I can't make a drum out of it now. I went to the door and the wedge was there. I kicked it. His voice made itself small. I kicked it because that's what you do when a door is blocked and you don't want it to be blocked. Then I realized my job had got in front of my head. You saw the runner? Hart asked. Back only, Renee said. A jacket with a reflective seam on the shoulder. The cheap kind with a stripe that shears ugly in the light.
A capítulo.
I don't remember the shoes. I'm sorry. If I did, I would tell you and then go lie down. You did fine, Hart said, which was true as far as it went. Did Kincaid have any standing arguments with you? Renee shook his head. He had standing arguments with everyone. With me? No. I set levels, I coiled cables. The politics above me were weather. The weather above him included Kincaid's recently terminated sound engineer. Hart rang Adler Acoustics before she rang Adler himself. The woman who answered was the kind of efficient that comes from surviving someone else's brilliance. Yes, she said, they made calibration calls. Yes, they serviced sound meters and work lights. Yes, Carl had been out a lot that week. No, she could not tell Hart where unless Hart sent a document that turned her no into a yes. Hart sent the document. When it came back with a list of deliveries and calibrations, 3 dates glowed. 1, 3 days prior. A sound meter calibration for a client name redacted at the client's request, paid in cash over the counter. 2, purchase of a Gauss magnet 3 weeks ago. 3, a roll of mesh listed as brass screen 200, the kind of stocking entry that would build a catcher if you added a frame. She thought of the reflective seam on Renee's runner. She thought of a jacket in a van. She thought of the locker at Hauptbahnhof that may or may not still hold its secrets by the time the warrant printed. She thought of a row that had spelled the simplest part of a suspect's name. Before she went to see Adler, she made time for the usual tour of Kincaid's personal orbit. The partner, who was trying not to rehearse sorrow. The assistant, who had already reached the bargaining stage with the universe. The bar staff across the canal, who remembered Kincaid because he always tipped in cash and never twice the same amount. Little facts, none yet a lever. What did lever was how consistently people used the same 3 words when they described Carl Adler. He's thorough, they said, or he's particular, or, less charitably, he's exhausting. People like that do not leave wedges with their fingerprints. They do not forget to plan for power. They do, however, leave traces when they believe they've outsmarted the world. They buy magnets. They rehearse timing. They put their names into systems they don't know other people can read. Until Price delivered her statistics and the transit officer delivered the locker, Hart would not allow herself the relief of a clean suspect. She funneled the day's findings back through the music. The row had given numbers, had given letters, had given a pulse. The room had given filings, light scoring, a breaker's hiccup. All clean, all professional, all just shy of an answer. At dusk, the canal took on its evening trick of becoming a mirror. Hart stood on the plank of walkway outside Canal Yard and let her eyes rest on the building's reflection rather than the bricks. It was less ugly that way. She ran the row in her head the way a child runs fingers along a fence. 12 little taps, 3 a touch harder. She counted to 2, to 7, to 11. The numbers wanted to be something. The job, as ever, was to ask them without telling them what they should say. Back inside, Ward met her with a printout and a face that did not want to be caught liking news. Locker logs, he said. 1 unit on line 3 shows a 6-digit ID opened yesterday at 1954 and not yet collected. The payment was a prepaid card. Bought 2 streets over from Adler's shop 10 minutes after his closing time. Hart let that ratchet 1 tooth forward and no more. We'll open it with the warrant we have, she said. We'll log the chain from the door to the desk, and then we'll go ask Mr. Adler what he thinks of music. Transit security kept their lockers like a small city within a larger one. Numbered corridors, camera globes like patient moons, the whole place smelling faintly of detergent and brake dust. The warrant had printed with a clerk's raised eyebrows that said we all have our days, and now Hart stood at line 3 with a transit officer and a property tech, both of whom wore expressions that made it clear they preferred football matches to this kind of opera. Unit 3C17, the officer said, checking the list. 6-digit credential shows an open at 1954 yesterday. Not yet collected. Prepaid card, no name. We'll log the access and the seal number. Hart looked at the door. Navy paint scuffed silver near the latch. A few stickers half peeled by bored hands. She glanced at the overhead dome. The camera? Running, the officer said. Image quality, average. You'll get the last 48 hours on a stick with a checksum. The property tech read the warrant number onto a small audio recorder and panned his body cam down the line like a tourist. Hart signed the logbook printout the officer held on a board. Then the officer keyed in a master sequence, and the little door snicked open with a reluctance that felt personal. Inside sat a black Pelican case with 2 latches and a throw of dust along its top you could have read with raking light. The tech slid on fresh gloves and lifted it like a cat carrier. He placed it on a rolling cart, checked that the cart surface had the right numbered evidence liner, and looked up for approval. Hart nodded. "Do not open it here," she said. "Chain to the lab. I want the first break under the hood." The officer sealed the locker with a new tag, logged the tag in duplicate, and handed Hart the custody receipt. The camera blinked at them like a bored eye. Back in the lab, the hood's glass was lower than Hart liked. She crouched down to put her eyes level with the join. The Pelican case sat on a white mat. The tech called out the seal number and Hart repeated it, then cut the zip tie and sprang the latches. The lid opened with the slow resistance of a long-held breath. Foam, custom-cut ovals and rectangles. In the left cavity, a brass catcher, aluminum frame, fine mesh bag folded into itself, a rubberized cuff to fit a slide. In the right, a consumer sound level meter with a calibration sticker from Adler Acoustics, date 3 days prior, serial partly scuffed by whatever had lived next to it on the ride. A pair of blue nitrile gloves lay tucked into a side cavity like shy creatures. Medium size, powder-free, the kind you buy by the 100. The tech did his music, high-res photos, scale rulers, the little tinted labels with numbers that make future juries feel someone did this carefully. Hart leaned in where the camera wouldn't mind. "Record the sticker," she said. "Macro. I want the exact date and the fragment of the serial that's visible. If Adler numbered his stickers sequentially, we can tie this to a block of paperwork. Bag each item separately. Swap gloves between items. Print the foam at the contact points if it'll hold." The tech gave her the look text reserved for requests that might result in nothing but still must be made. "Foam rarely holds," he said, "but will dust for the mesh impression and the cuff shape." He lifted the brass catcher out and rotated it under the hood light. The mesh had a run near the seam, 2 wires separated like a tiny ladder. He photographed it, then measured the diameter of the wire with a caliper and read off. "Looks like 200 screen. That's a standard stocking." "Sound level meter," Hart said. "Power it on with a bench supply, not its internal battery. Don't touch the memory." Price had drifted in behind them, her scarf now a more subdued knot. She watched the catcher with the kind of detached curiosity academics reserve for objects outside their field. "If you were writing a manual for a housekeeping murder," she said, "that would be in the kit." Hart didn't smile. She kept her eyes on the sticker. Adler Acoustics Cal 03/17 S/N. The last digits were scuffed, but the leading block was intact. The tech bagged the gloves and lifted the small envelope tucked under the sound meter. It was the size of a receipt sleeve, and the flap had a smear of transfer graphite black. Inside, 2 thermal receipts. One read Adler Acoustics, calibration, mic/SPL, cash, date 3 days prior. The other reads Screen Brass 200, 1 roll. Same shop, earlier date. The shop's address, the same as the one in Hart's notes, printed at the bottom in letters that had faded where heat had kissed the paper. "Chain these separately," Hart said. "We'll fight about hearsay later. For now, they tell a story I'd like to hear again." She stepped out to the corridor to call Ward. "We have the catcher, a meter with Adler sticker, gloves, and receipts. Locker access logged 1954. Get me the video from this line and any cameras approaching." Start a gate analysis request to compare the depositor with Carl Adler. And get someone polite to talk to Adler's floor manager about their sticker serials. We'll want to match that number block to a logbook entry. She returned to the hood. The tech had laid the catcher's mesh against a sheet of acetate and taken an impression with chalk to capture the pattern of the run. He had then compared it to a short length of mesh retrieved from the shop's waste bin during a preliminary visit, well within a warrant's reach if they got one. He hadn't gone to the shop yet, of course. Hart's mind was moving faster than the day. She tacked it back to now. "Helena," she said, "walk me through the digit mapping on the board again, clean. I want it formalized before we set foot in a courtroom someday." Price obligingly went to the whiteboard, wiped the ghosts of earlier notes, and wrote in square, teacherly letters. C equals 0, C sharp equals 1, D equals 2, D hashtag equals 3, E equals 4, F equals 5, F sharp equals 6, G equals 7, G hashtag equals 8, A equals 9, A hashtag equals 10, B equals 11. She drew small circles for the 12 pitch classes and labeled them. We read Alice's row as, she wrote the order, then transcribed to numbers. She wrote the digits. We then marked separators at positions 2, 7, and 11 because of her consistent dynamic accents. Spikes at those indices across takes. Grouping by those separators yields a 6-digit block. She wrote it, and then a 3-digit block. She wrote that too. The first maps cleanly to the locker ID. The second corresponds to a line number within the bank. In this case, 3. Statistically, Hart asked, random 12-tone rows will produce many 6-digit sequences if you apply this mapping, yes, Price said. But the alignment with a real open locker in the target time window in the same city, used with a prepaid card bought near Adler's shop on the same evening, it moves you from happenstance toward design. Once you layer the interval cipher, if it holds, and the dynamics to Morse, if it holds, you have convergent evidence. Courts like convergence. Courts like chain of custody, Hart said. Glancing at the evidence labels the tech was filling out in block letters. We'll give them that too. Ward arrived with a printout that made him look as if someone had told him a happy story, and he didn't trust it. Video, he said, and held up a drive. Our depositor wears a cap and a jacket with a high visibility seam along the shoulder. His gait analysis guys think there's knee asymmetry on the right. Adler took a stage fall 6 years ago. His insurance report mentions patellar issues. Don't oversell it, Hart said, but keep the link ready. We can get the medical via subpoena if this gets past probable cause. She took the drive to the lab monitor and watched the footage. A man stepping into the frame with a Pelican case, checking the board with the kind of frown that says, I know where I'm going but I dislike signs, a cap pulled low, that reflective stripe on the jacket shoulder she'd heard about from Renee. The man opened the locker, slid the case in, closed it, and walked away with an economy of motion that suggested rehearsal. The whole thing took under 20 seconds. The timestamp read 19 hours, 54 minutes, and 12 seconds. Hart let the frame sit a beat, the jacket stripe a diagonal against the monotony of locker doors. She didn't need to say, that's him, to herself. The case would say it better in foam impressions and stickers and receipts. Back in the hood, the tech had shaved a sliver of fiber from the Pelican foam with a microtome and bagged it for later comparison with foam from Adler's flight case if they found it. He had also swabbed the interior for trace, though nitrile and clean hands leave little that wants to make a lab technician famous. Anything else? He asked. Enough, Hart said. For today. They closed the case, tagged the items, and wheeled the cart into property. Hart signed where signatures accumulate and allow time to move. On the way out, Price walked beside her, matching her pace the way people do when they know not to step on a line. The row is doing what you needed, Price said. It gave you digits that led to a door. The door gave you objects that returned to your suspect's name via sticker and receipts. It's a tidy circle. Tidy circles make me superstitious, Hart said. I want a triangle. You'll have one when the interval spells something you can put in a report, Price said. And if the dynamics give you a map reference, you'll have a tetrahedron and I'll write a paper. Hart stopped at the end of the corridor and looked back down its length. The lab hummed. The city's bad air made a visible weight in the windows yellow. She pictured Alice in Studio B, laying out the 12 like bread slices, the 3 accents like a hand pressed down 3 times to say pay attention here, here, and here. A teenager had built a bridge with pitches. Hart's job was to walk it without falling in love with the view. Intervals next, she said. We put letters on the steps and see if the alphabet wants to play fair. She thumbed a message to Ward to schedule an interview with Carl Adler, non-custodial for now, and to get a warrant drafted for Adler Acoustics, narrowly tailored to sticker logs, magnet sales, and mesh inventory. She texted Renee to ask whether he could identify a jacket with a shoulder stripe if shown a lineup of garments. The little logistics that make a case stop being a story and start being a file. Price tucked her scarf tighter. I'll be in my office for an hour if you need me, she said. Send the interval data. I'll run the conversion clean and keep my adjectives in a drawer. Hart nodded. There was work that felt like music and work that felt like carpentry. The day had given both. She headed for her desk, the board, the phone, the next line of numbers that wanted to become letters. Price's office looked the way careful minds look. Books aligned like teeth. A piano pushed against the wall with its lid closed as if to keep opinions from escaping. She had cleared a space on the table and laid out 3 printouts. Alice's original row from the memo, the 2 laboratory takes, and a blank staff for show. Hart took the chair with the line of sight to the door. It was a habit she didn't bother to call superstition. We keep this simple, Price said. No mysticism, no composer's lore. We treat the row like a staircase and count the risers. She tapped a pencil on the first note. Between each successive pitch, count semitone steps, always the smallest directed interval if we think in mod 12. Then map 1 to A, 2 to B, 26 to Z. If a step produces a number greater than 26, wrap around modulo 26. If it produces 0, rare the way we're counting, treat 0 as Z or throw it out, but we won't have zeros here because she never repeats a pitch class. Hart nodded once. You did this on all 3 takes? Twice, Price said. On the memo and on the first lab performance. The second lab take I used as a control for accent indexing only. Watch. She read aloud as she wrote the interval counts between the first 5 pairs, then converted them. A, D, L, E, R. She let the pencil rest. It isn't subtle. Show me it's not a fluke of starting pitch, Hart said. That's the virtue of intervals, Price said. They're invariant under transposition. When Alice restarted higher on the keyboard, the absolute pitches changed, but the steps between stayed the same. The conversion yields the same letter string at the head. And before you ask, no, I didn't slide a window hoping to find a name. We begin at the row's head because the row is ordered testimony, and the first 5 intervals give us the name clean. Hart leaned closer. What about the rest of the string? We can't stand up in court with 5 letters and a flourish. Price uncapped a second pen, blue beside the black, to keep stages separate. After Adler, the sequence continues, less obligingly. Past the 5th step, it veers into non-words. V, Q, H. The usual noise. That's what you expect when the encoding targets a specific small payload. Name at the head. The rest is tail. We don't get to invent more English where there isn't any. Statistics? Hart asked. I ran a simple Monte Carlo, Price said, and slid a 1-page printout across the table. 10,000 random 12-tone rows, intervals computed as here, then alphabetized. The frequency of a 5-letter English surname appearing at the head by chance, low, but not astronomically so. Add the constraint that the surname matches a specific person in the victim's orbit, lower. Add the digit layer corroboration leading to a locker that yielded your catcher and meter, lower again. The conjunction becomes persuasive. Hart skimmed the page because the gesture mattered more than the numbers. She trusted Price to state them cleanly on a stand. Defense will say you hunted for a name you already suspected. I hadn't read your suspect list when I ran the pass, Price said. You can have my emails to document it. If you like, I can repeat the process in the presence of a court officer with a fresh copy of the row chosen at random from your sealed sources. The method's transparent. Hart checked her phone. Ward had texted. Warrant drafted for Adler Acoustics. ADA wants tighter scope on magnet inventory language. Hart typed back surgical language. Purchase records for permanent magnets 02 to 01 to present. Calibration log stickers 01 to 01 to present. Brass screen stock entries and disposals January 01 to present. Customer identity logs for cash repairs in week of the 17th, and sent it upstream. The reply came, approved. Price flipped to the velocity overlays again. Indices 2, 7, 11 are stable across takes. I'm not married to Morse, but your short, long/long, long/short, long/short reading to you, MR is defensible. If you had no city map reference grid that uses UMR, I would file it under pareidolia. But you do. Public Works plans label grids UMR, Hart said. R3 is the square the fire stairs sit in. We'll keep that layer to corroborate route, not identity. Good, Price said. Keep identity on the letters. Keep location on the dynamics. Keep the digits for your locker. Hart's phone buzzed again. The transit stills had been enhanced enough to show the jacket seem Renee remembered. Ward added a note. Adler's insurance report from 6 years ago mentioned right knee patellar strain. Gate analyst says depositor favors right leg on push-off, consistent with that pattern. The kind of thing a defense could dent but not dismiss. Helena, Hart said, walk me through how you'll talk about this in front of 12 people who don't want to be there. I'll say, the witness provided a sequence of tones using all 12 pitch classes once, establishing a deliberate 12-tone row. We tested repeatability under controlled conditions. The order and accented positions persisted. We used 3 independent, pre-specified mappings. Pitch to digit producing a 6 and 3 digit block that matched a live locker and line. Interval to letter producing the surname Adler at the head, and accent pattern interpreted as Morse yielding UMR, a code used by the city's grid maps that situates the escape route. Each mapping addresses a different property of the same artifact. Convergence of outcomes across independent city systems, transit lockers, personal identity, municipal grid, argues against coincidence. We provide the scripts and code used, and we show the timing window via tempo analysis consistent with TOD logs. She smiled faintly, and then I avoid saying Schönberg. Hart allowed herself the edge of a smile. Avoid jokes about 12 angry men, too. Price's phone chimed. And I'll bring this, she added, lifting a small plastic metronome from her desk. Not for the jury, for Alice when we're done. Hart stood. Intervals give us the name. Digits gave us the locker. Dynamics point the route. We're done exploiting the row for now. Time to see if the man likes rooms with questions. On her way out, Hart called the ADA to coordinate the shop warrant service. 2 uniforms would accompany bodycams live, scope narrow. They would ask for sticker logs, mesh inventory, sales of magnets and jammers, outgoing calibration receipts, employee schedules. If Adler tried to play privileged client, they would politely take the ledgers and leave the names under seal until a judge told them which ones they could read. She texted Renee, who replied with a hesitant, I can try. When asked to look at a lineup of work jackets with reflective seams, she had property pull high-vis jackets impounded in unrelated cases and photograph them under controlled light to build the array. Sometimes craft mattered where witnesses didn't think it would. By late afternoon, Hart stood at the glass of Adler Acoustics, watching the reflection of her own face overlaid on racks of gear. Inside, a woman with survival in her eyes, same one from the phone, looked up, clocked the uniforms before the bell had finished ringing, and set down a roll of labels as if it were explosive. Mr. Adler? Hart said. In the back, the woman said, tuning a monitor that didn't ask to be tuned. Carl Adler came out wiping his hands on a clean rag the way mechanics do when they want you to know the rag is clean. He was leaner than Hart had pictured, capless, hair thinning, the right knee a hint of stiffness as he shaped himself around the counter. He saw the warrant in her hand the way a man sees weather. Detective, he said, if this is about Daniel Kincaid, I already told a friend I didn't like him enough to help him, and not enough to hurt him. We'll talk, Hart said, and handed him the paper that rearranged his afternoon. First, we'll inventory some paperwork. As the uniforms peeled off toward the office with the woman leading, Hart watched Adler's hands. Careful hands. He measured his sentences the way he measured decibels, down to tenths. The intervals, she thought, had spelled his name. Now the room would ask whether the rest of him matched the steps. The interview room Hart chose wasn't the one with the bolted chair or the camera in the corner that made people perform. It was the consultation room with a window onto a courtyard no one used, 2 upholstered chairs, and a carafe of water that had been poured an hour ago and would taste like decisions. Non-custodial, Ward had reminded her. Come in voluntarily, leave if you like. It was a useful fiction. People rarely exercised it when the door closed softly behind them. Carl Adler sat with his back straight and his hands on his knees, a conservatory student waiting for a jury that would talk about touch. He looked around the room once, quick, to catalog entrances, exits, the camera lens hidden behind a smoke disc. He wore a plain jacket, no reflective seam tonight, jeans that did not try too hard, and boots that wanted to be work but had mostly seen sidewalks. His right knee made itself known when he crossed his leg and then decided not to. Coffee? Hart asked. I'll keep my hands empty, Adler said, and folded them together, then unfolded them, as if the hands had other ideas. Thank you for coming, Hart said. You are not under arrest. You're free to leave. I do have questions. Adler nodded in a way that said of course and also no. Ask. She let the first minute be slow. Did you know Daniel Kincaid? Professionally, Adler said. We worked rooms he booked. I provided safety reviews, calibration, monitoring. We argued about the difference between compliance and safety. He preferred compliance. You stopped working for him last month, Hart said. He stopped hiring me, Adler said, as if it were the same fact. He called it a dispute. I called it a decision. Did you meet with him this week? Hart asked. No, Adler said. I sent 2 emails about outstanding invoices. He sent one reply I would not read back to you if you wanted children in the room. Hart set a notepad on the table and wrote nothing. Last night between 2100 and 2200? Warehouse 12, Adler said. Mixed position. I was there from 2030 until past 22. We had a live act that imagined subtlety as a tempo map. I can give you the export file and the track list. You can check the club's cameras. Export files don't prove presence, Hart said, almost kindly. They tell me a computer finished a job. They don't tell me where your hands were. Adler's mouth flattened. The cameras will show me in a hat wearing the wrong expression. The house manager, Lorna Meach, will confirm. The band will complain that I would not let them bury the vocal under the synth. You left the venue at any point? Hart asked. To smoke, Adler said, and then, perhaps remembering the calculus of details, added, twice, short, front door. Hart let the beat pass. Do you own a Pelican case? Half the city does, Adler said, then caught himself. Yes, for tools. A brass catcher? Hart asked. Adler blinked like a man whose eye had found grit. For a firearm? No, I have no interest in guns. I prefer problems that don't decide the ending. A sound level meter? Yes, he said. Several. They come and go. We calibrate them. It is what we do. You purchased a Gauss magnet last month, Hart said, reading as if from fiction. A strong one. Adler smiled, barely. We demo stage illusions for clients who want to understand why we say no to certain rigs. You would be surprised what people think is safe because someone on a message board said so. Magnets make bodies behave detective. They also make misreadings. Where did you go at 1954 yesterday? Hart asked. Adler looked at her and saw the line she wanted drawn. Home, he said. Then, as if to add integrity by addition, via the station. I buy sandwiches there. I hate the ones near my flat. If you have me on a camera, I'm buying a sandwich that will break my heart. Hart leaned forward enough to suggest listening. You used a parcel locker? No, Adler said, and it was the one beat he didn't smooth by explanation. Hart let silence be a third person in the room. In silence, people either remember or invent. Adler did neither. He adjusted his knee. We recovered a Pelican case from a locker at Hauptbahnhof, Hart said. Inside, a brass catcher with mesh, a sound level meter bearing a calibration sticker from Adler Acoustics dated 3 days prior, a pair of nitrile gloves, and receipts from your counter, one for the meter calibration, one for a roll of brass screen marked 200. There is also video of a man depositing the case at 1954, wearing a cap and a jacket with a reflective seam on the shoulder. Gait analysis suggests a right knee favoring push-off. You filed an insurance report 6 years ago for a patellar strain. Do you understand why I'm asking about these objects and your knee? Adler didn't move for a long second. I understand why, he said finally. I do not accept your conclusion. Which part? Hart asked. The idea that a sticker proves possession, Adler said. We calibrate meters for hundreds of clients. Stickers travel with objects. A roll of brass screen is not contraband. Gloves are gloves. As for a case in a locker, my answer's the same as it was no. Do you own a jacket with a high visibility seam? Hart asked. Yes, Adler said. It makes men in vans less invisible than they think they are. Hundreds of people own them. They like to believe the reflective stripe will save them from physics. You were fired by Kincaid, Hart said. He threatened to expose your rigs as unsafe. That would cost you work. Daniel threatened to expose Daniel's competence by speaking, Adler said, almost gently. He enjoyed theater. He was less fond of rope load charts. The city would not have closed my doors because Daniel didn't like being told where to put a truss. Hart folded the notepad closed over a blank page. Tell me about your day before the show. Adler gave her a list that smelled like someone had spent years being asked to recount days. Morning at the shop. 2 calibrations, 1 consultation. Lunch at my bench. Afternoon delivery of LED work lights to a warehouse on the river. You'll find the invoice. Back to the shop for a client who wanted their monitor to stop lying. Load in at warehouse 12 at 1900. Sound check. A staff meal I didn't eat. Show at 20:30. You made a cash sale 3 days ago for meter calibration, Hart said. Client's name redacted at request. Our clerk redacts when clients ask and pay cash, Adler said. It is not illegal to be private. Did you calibrate that specific meter? The one we recovered in the last week? I calibrate many meters, Adler said. If you have a serial number that isn't smeared by some idiot with a screwdriver, I can tell you whose. We'll serve a warrant for those logs, Hart said. We did, in fact. My colleagues are applying it as we speak. Adler's eyes cooled a degree. Then they will find what there is to find. Hart stood not as a move to end but to change air pressure. I'm going to step out and ask my colleague to bring a few photographs. A still from the station camera. A lineup of jackets. You can say yes, no, or I don't know. You can also ask to leave. The door works both ways. She left before he could rehearse a reply and found Ward in the observation room with the stills and the array. Ward's look said we're good, not great. Video's serviceable, he said. You can see the stripe, the cap. Angle isn't love. The jacket lineup under controlled light is better. The seam in slot 4 matches Renee's description. Bring them in, Hart said. Back in the room, Adler looked at the still without touching it. That is a man carrying a case, he said. It could be me if you wish it. It could be any man with my dimensions and a bad knee. And the jacket? Hart asked, laying the array. 8 high-vis work jackets photographed under the same raking angle. Do you own one like any of these? Adler pointed at 3. The seam patterns vary by cheap manufacturer. Those 3 are cousins. I own one of that family. If that makes me a murderer, arrest every forklift operator in the district. Hart didn't pick up the dare. I'll book these responses as non-exclusionary. Then, I have one more question for now. The fire door at Canal Yard shows magnet scoring on the latch face. Fresh. The wedge beneath it holds a smear of grinder compound with graphite. In the corridor carpet, brass filings consistent with a catcher mesh. The building's subpanel logs a trip at 2117 that matches an LED work light slam-on. Your shop sold a Gauss magnet, brass screen, LED work lights, and calibrated a meter 3 days ago. Do you see the shape we see? Adler rubbed his knee, an indulgence he probably didn't allow himself in front of clients. I see a shape, he said. I also see a city full of shapes that fit more than one puzzle. If you want to fit me to it, you will. If you want to fit someone else, you can. I fix sound because sound pretends to be math and then panics and becomes weather. You are trying to hear math in weather. Hart let out a breath she could call a laugh later if she wanted. Are you willing to provide tower location data from your phone for the period 1900 to 2200 yesterday? Voluntarily. We can obtain it by warrant if we must. Adler looked at the window to the unused courtyard, at the dust on the sill that had written its own history. If I say no, I look guilty. If I say yes, I give you a map you will read the way you like. You could also look helpful, Hart said. And if the map puts you where you say you were, it will save us both time. He thought about time and about maps. Then he nodded once. Have your form, he said. I will authorize my provider to release tower records. I will also give you the export file you will tell me is worthless, because it is the same everywhere. Ward slid the consent form across the table, and Adler signed like a man who had practiced the shapes in another life. When he left, politely, with no hand at his elbow, Hart stood a long moment in the doorway and listened the way she had listened in Studio A. The room had held a man who believed he was smarter than rooms. Those were the ones who left trails that looked like anonymous whether until they were graphed. Within an hour, the preliminary tower hit came back. Adler's phone had pinged a sector near Hauptbahnhof at 1954, a sector that covered the locker line. Later, it straddled Canal Yard from 2110 to 2120, moving just enough to suggest a person taking the long way around a building to avoid obvious doors. At 2128, a ping near Warehouse 12. The line stood up, locker, canal, stage. Ward set the printout beside the still from the station. It won't convict him, he said. It isn't meant to, Hart said. It's meant to make the row stop looking like parlor cleverness. She looked at the stack. Catcher, meter, gloves, receipts, tower pings, a knee that preferred the past to the present. She looked at the word Adler on Price's page. She looked at the digits that had opened a door. She looked at the smudge on a wedge, the scratch on a latch, the little filing of brass in a carpet seam. Rooms were weather until you learned the season. We'll need the music to say more than a name, she said, half to Ward, half to the air. If it can tell me route and time, I want it on the record before I put cuffs on a man who thinks he knows when thunder will arrive. There are kinds of evidence juries can hold in their hands, and there are kinds they can only watch. Hart needed the first kind, but the case had handed her the second, the shape of a man, the clock of a breaker, the ghost of a mesh. The only artifact that insisted on being both was the row. It lived as a file and as something fingers had done. If there was one more use to squeeze from it, it would be in the way Alice had leaned on 3 notes and not the others. Price set the lab up like a small conservatory practical. The digital piano fed the console. The console fed a DAW. The DAW fed another screen that graphically displayed keystroke velocity, as the instrument understood it, MIDI numbers on a scale from 1 to 127. Price preferred to call them impulses, the human part of the contact. Hart preferred the word that made a chart. We're not hunting for poetry, Price said. We're quantifying where she pressed harder. Alice sat where she had sat before, the blanket exchanged for a soft hoodie that the victim liaison had found in a locker of donated clothes. She nodded when Hart said hello. She placed her right hand in air above middle C and waited for Price's cue. Same row, Price said. But think of the 3 notes you made a little louder. Make them as exactly louder as you can, the way you did. Don't exaggerate to help us. Alice's nod was smaller but more certain. She began. The green bars marched up the 2nd, 7th, and 11th positions like flags Hart could believe in. 92, 94, 93 against a field of mid-80s. On the second take they landed 91, 95, 92. On the third, 93, 94, 94. Not exact, not machine. Exact enough to be a signature. Price overlaid the 3 takes and drew boxes around the spikes. Same indices. Within human variance, same emphasis. Now, if we take the emphases in groups, what we call phrasing when we teach music, we can read short and long by relative duration, too. She pointed to a second strip the DAW had drawn. Note lengths in milliseconds. This isn't just how hard, it's how long. Watch. First emphasis, 2 short taps, followed by 1 longer. Second emphasis, 2 long taps. Third short, long, short. If we translate short as dot and long as dash, we get dash U, dot dash dot. R. Ward, hovering in an engineer's approximation of reverent silence, said, Omar, you said that before. Public Works uses UMR on its grid maps, urban map reference, Hart said. R is the row, the numeral is the column. They grid the city in alphanumeric blocks for engineering. If our third cluster cues are we need a number, where do we get a number? Price was already moving. Tempo and bar groupings can mark time and count. Alice's average tempo is 84 beats per minute. Between the clusters, she plays in little islands not evenly spaced. If we count beats from the start to each accent cluster, we might get a numeral. They ran the file again, this time with the metronome audible. Hart watched Price tap a foot and count under breath. At the first accent, Price raised a finger, 2 beats from start to the first accent's first note. She let the row continue. At the second cluster, another finger, 7 beats from the start of the row to the second cluster's first note. At the third cluster, 11 beats, 2, 7, 11. The same indices that had been louder. A girl's body had kept time and given numbers the room already knew. UMR R3, R2, R no, Ward said, catching himself. The letters are U, M, R. We still need a number for the R. Price laid a transparent ruler over the piano roll view and measured bars instead of beats. At Alice's tempo, the entire row is just under 9 seconds long. If we count measures of 4, her third accent falls early in measure 3. She circled it. Call that R3. R as the letter from Morse, 3 as the measure index. It's not elegant, but it's consistent across takes. Hart took the Public Works PDF the city's council had coughed up years ago and laid it on the light table the lab used for footprint comparisons. The UMR grid overlaid the city like a faint crossword. She traced the rectangle labeled R3 with a pen cap. The canal yard block sat inside it like a correct guess. She slid the transparency south to R2, west to Q3, checking for the kinds of coincidences that make prosecutors blush. R3 was the one that mattered. The fire stair Hart had ridden with a magnet in the reconstruction sat inside R3, and the landing where the wedge had been found had a small square labeled on the engineering sheet for alarm contact. Route, Hart said. Row to UMR to R3. It's a map reference in the language of the people who draw doors. Price nodded. Dynamics to Morse for the letters, tempo groupings to resolve a numeral. I don't love how it stretches, but the repetition across takes and the existence of the independent system make it admissible if you give the jury a ladder. Time, Hart asked. Can we make the row testify to the clock, not just to the route? Tempo can be a metronome, Price said, and spun her metronome's dial to 84, the number she'd pulled from Alice's pulse. If the row begins at a known time marker, the breaker trip, say, we can convert positions to wall time by beat count. Hart thought of the subpanel log. 21:17 is when the breaker kicked. EMS put TOD between 21:14 and 21:18. If the row started when the power died, we can plant the accents on the timeline. That's risky. No guarantee she began to play at the exact instant of the trip. Alice saved her the speculation. She raised a hand. Hart nodded to let her speak without speaking. Alice held up 3 fingers and then pointed to the metronome. She tapped the bench 3 times with a knuckle in time with the metronome, then started the row at the 4th notional click, as if counting herself in. When she finished, she tapped the bench twice, looked at Hart, and held up her phone like she was looking at a clock face. Price translated. She counted 3 in her head, then began. She knows she did that. The phone's timestamp can give us the file start. With the trip at 21 hours and 17 minutes, if she counted 3 beats at 84 BPM, about 2.14 seconds per 4 beats, or 0.714 seconds per beat. Then she began roughly 2.14 seconds after the trip. We can frame her first accent at 21:17:02 something, the second at plus beat count, and so on. Even if we don't argue absolute seconds, we can argue the row conforms to the TOD window. The tech, who had been pretending not to be part of the conversation, raised a hand. File metadata from the memo shows a create time of 21 hours, 17 minutes, and 6 seconds local. That's when the app started writing plus phone OS overhead. It brackets what you're saying. Put it in an appendix, Hart said. Juries hate decimals but love pictures. We'll show the breaker log, the EMS window, the metronome at 84, the piano roll with beat counts, and a big friendly arrow that says within. She stepped away to call Public Works. A long-suffering engineer confirmed that yes, UMR is a legacy tag on grid maps, still in use by contracted trades. Yes, R3 covers the canal yard block. Yes, the fire egress on the east face is labeled in the plan set as contact R3 EUS. He sounded pleased to talk to someone who wasn't asking about potholes. Get me a certified copy of the plan sheet with that label, Hart said. We'll need it as a business record. And someone from your shop on standby to explain the notation in 2 sentences. She hung up and texted Ward. Route UMR R3 from Dynamics/Tempo. Time. Row aligns to trip at 21:17 per file metadata and beat count. Prep demonstratives. Ward responded with a thumbs up that looked begrudging even in emoji. Price slid the printed overlays into a folder the color of good intentions. You now have 4 orthogonal signals from a single artifact, she said. Digits for a locker, intervals for a name, dynamics and phrasing for a grid reference, tempo for temporal alignment. None requires the others to be true. All point to the same person and path. Orthogonal is a word a judge will make me translate, Hart said. I'll say independent, and then I'll point to the Pelican case and the sticker and the receipts and the tower pings and the wedge and the filings and the magnet scrapes so they don't think we solved a murder with a crossword. Alice had stood, as if dismissed by some private bell. Hart stepped to her. You did what people twice your age forget how to do, she said, keeping her mouth slow and her voice low. You told the truth in a language you own. Alice's eyes softened, and her shoulders dropped a centimeter, the body's tiny permission to rest. On the way out, Hart stopped by the reconstruction bay, the ugly concrete room every department had for exercises that shouldn't happen in a nicer space. She borrowed a magnet from property and a door from a storage rack and rode the latch again, watching the field grab the plate and the scoring lines it left. Under a flashlight, the parallel ticks looked the way the lab's photographs looked. She timed the path from door to piano to door with Ward jogging the corridor carrying a blanked replica, a mesh bag clipped to the side of a training slide. 65 seconds, give or take a heartbeat. It would match the tower's hop to Canal Yard at 21:10 to 21:20. Put the video of this run in the file, she said, and get me a still of the wedge on the landing with the plan sets R3 label inset. We'll make the map talk. They had begun the day with a row that looked like a clever teenager's refusal to panic. They ended it with a ladder of facts you could put numbers to, a locker that opened, a case that held exactly the tools the room described, a set of letters that knew the suspect's name, a route stamped on a grid an engineer would recognize, a tempo that sat in the same window a coroner would. Hart stood at the lab door with her coat half on and looked back at the screens. On one, Alice's green bars rose at 2, 7, 11. On another, the transit depositor's cap tilted under a camera that hadn't tried to help. On a third, a plan sheet showed R3 like a square of water on a map of land. Tomorrow, she said to Ward, to Price, to the room. We close the loop from locker to shop to van to jacket to man. Price tapped the folder. And then your triangle becomes a square. Hart shook her head once. Then we start building the box that keeps him. With UMR R3 and the timing window locked, Hart moved for the chain, Pelican foam to flight case foam, sticker serial to logbook, prepaid card to point-of-sale camera, until the objects chose a single owner. Property had logged the Pelican contents like they were a traveling exhibit, each item with its own manifest. Hart needed to turn that traveling show into a closed loop, objects that left one domain and entered another in ways only one person could have arranged. The ADA, skimming her summary with a prosecutor's speed, handed back the signed bundle with the dry formality of rain. Scope: sticker logs, inventory, brass screen, magnets, LED work lights, point-of-sale records, prepaid card sales on the 17th, outgoing calibration receipts for the week, employee schedules, and any case foam cut for transport systems. Secondary warrant for Adler's van. Tools, garments, foam, and any Pelican cases. They served the shop warrant just after opening. The floor manager, the same woman with survival in her eyes, met them with a clipboard already squared on the counter. "We'll comply," she said. "Please be specific so I can be quick." Ward read the warrant aloud to the body cams because the camera likes ritual. They started with the small book the shop used for calibration stickers. A bound stack of carbonless forms pre-printed with Adler Acoustics Cal and a handwritten serial sequence that walked forward one tick per job. The sticker on the meter from the locker showed Cal 03/17 S/N7K, the tail smeared by abrasion. The ledger gave them Cal entries on March 17th for 3 meters, 2 with client names, 1 marked cash, NO name, sticker sequence numbers jumping exactly as the remaining stickers in the book predicted. "Photograph each ledger page," Hart said. "Then bag the book." The manager frowned. "Clients." "Under seal," Hart said. "Judge decides what we can read. We're not here to crater your week." Next, inventory. The brass screen entry, screen brass 201 roll, sat on a page like a harmless purchase. The roll itself lay on a lower shelf, a cylinder of fine grid with a paper sleeve. Hart measured the wire gauge and mesh count against the catcher from the locker. The caliper read the same. On the workbench, a short offcut, maybe 20 centimeters long, curled like a dead leaf. "Bag the offcut," Hart said, "and photo the ends." One end showed a small run in the weave, 2 wires separated in a ladder-like flaw. The Pelican catcher's seam had shown a matching run. The tech had chalked it onto acetate. Under the lab's overlay later, the run in the offcut and the run on the catcher laid atop one another like halves of a tear. The Gauss magnet sale printed with a timestamp and a partial card pan. The card was a prepaid Visa, last 4 XXXX, because that's how the terminal liked to pretend to be discreet. They'd get the kiosk's camera and match shirt, hat, hands. The LED worklight invoice showed delivery to a warehouse on the river at 1400, consistent with Adler's afternoon delivery recitation. None of it screamed. All of it said, "You were here." Adler watched the inventory with the restlessness of a cat not allowed into a room. "Am I under arrest?" he asked at one point. "You're under a document," Hart said. "Different thing." His mouth made a line. "You haven't asked where I bought my sandwiches." "We'll get to that," Hart said. The van warrant went on its own clock. Out back, in a lot that had seen winter more than it liked, Adler's white panel van waited under a light that gave everything a hospital tone. The van smelled like gaffer tape and old gigs, foam, plastic, the democracy of tools. In the cargo area, a flight case the size of a dog lay strapped next to a coil of truss clamps. The foam inside, black, egg crate on one side, flat on the other, bore a rectangular depression with rounded corners, the way a Pelican case rested when someone stored it cushioned down. The depression's dimension matched the locker case within a few millimeters. "Macro the foam cell pattern," Hart said. "Different manufacturers use slightly different molds. If we can match the cell geometry to the shard we shaved from the Pelican's foam, we can at least say they came from the same production batch." The lab, later, under a microscope, would align the cell mouths, slight teardrops on one brand, more square on another, and say consistent with. Not unique, but felt like a fingerprint if you stood back and squinted responsibly. A jacket hung from a hook behind the driver's seat. High visibility seam across the shoulder, cheap reflective tape already cracking at the crease. Hart bagged it herself. On the cuff, a faint dust that the handheld's quick test liked for silica and polymer, composition consistent with acoustic foam dust. Back at the lab, the cuff's trace would share a mineral signature with the panel in Studio A. The same chalky filler, the same binder. On the jacket's shoulder seam, a fleck of rosin. The lab's FTIR would match it to the violin room's dust that lived in the canal yard air, because rosin's a snob and likes to be recognized. Ward, in the van's console bin, found a roll of nitrile gloves, medium blue. Not illegal, not unique, not exciting. He bagged them carefully anyway, because cases are built out of dozens of things that aren't exciting. Back at the shop counter, Hart asked for the point-of-sale records for prepaid card purchases on the evening of the 17th. "We don't sell prepaid here," the manager said. "The kiosk on Connex-Lee does. Our terminal records will show cash, card, tap. That's it." Connex-Lee sat 2 blocks away under a canopy of cheap LEDs. The kiosk's owner, a man whose patience had been filed to a polished arc by years of lottery small talk, pulled the footage after Ward slid the narrow warrant under the plexi with the weary grace of a parent handing over a permission slip. The camera angle stared down at a shoulder and a crown of head. At 1941, the picture caught a man in a cap buying a prepaid card and a pack of gum with currency and receiving coins he didn't count. The man's jacket shoulder flashed a diagonal seam when he turned. The gum brand matched the wrapper in Adler's Van cup holder, which meant nothing and looked good. "Receipt?" Hart asked. The owner waved a hand. "Prepaids print a stub. You can have the Z reading. The timestamp matches your time. You think I sell felonies with the scratchers? I sell ignorance. It's less work." The parcel locker stills had their own chain. The station IT gave Hart the segment around 1954. The man with the cap, the quick, efficient door, the case inside. Gate analysis had an easier time when they could see the body in 3 steps instead of 1. The right knee lagged a fraction on the turn, a signature many men owned, but Carl Adler's insurance report named. At the lab, the mesh offcut and the catcher's run married as expected. The Pelican foam cell print and the van's foam showed patterns that a half-honest expert could say were consistent enough to share a parent. The sticker ledger's serial gap boxed the day. The calibration sticker on the meter fell inside it. The cashier's cal entry with cash NO name became the center of gravity for that sticker row. The nitrile gloves showed the same manufacturer lot as a partial box in Adler's back room. Again, not a scream, not a smoking anything, but a choir when stacked. Chain of custody had its own choreography. Hart made sure every page had a slash of her initials over a seal. Every handoff had time and name. Every video pull had a checksum. The ADA didn't want to lose a single piece not because each was decisive, but because the defense would need them all to wobble the structure, and Hart didn't intend to give them a wobble. 2 small things put satisfying teeth on the chain. First, the Pelican foam had impressions of the catcher's mesh cuff. Tiny parallel lines pressed into the foam where the rubberized ring sat when the case had been loaded lazily. In Adler's workshop bin, underspent gaffer and a handful of crimped connectors, a piece of rubber cuff with an identical ridged profile. Under magnification, the mold artifacts, a little nick at the 4th ridge, matched. The cuff from the bin had torn. The catcher's cuff had the missing nick. Second, the sound meter's calibration sticker had been sliced when someone peeled tape from it. The sliced edge showed a microfiber of shop towel that matched a brand the manager kept under the counter. Uncommon blue-white blend the lab could call consistent with. Small teeth, but teeth. Gate says yes, foam says likely, mesh says yes, sticker says yes, cuff says bite. Ward summarized, stacking the reports. Card at the kiosk says he was buying the key to the locker 10 minutes before he fed it. Tower puts him at the locker at 1954, Hart said. Tower puts him near Canal Yard at 2110 through 2120. He says he was at Warehouse 12 at 2020-30. The hop fits the rehearsal run. Nothing yet puts him actually pulling the trigger. But we don't need a camera in the room. We need a path with only one walker. Price, who had come by to collect interval graphs for her tidy folder, tapped the mesh imprint acetate with a nail. "This is the kind of prosaic detail juries like more than math," she said. "Foam and rubber are good stagehands. They don't editorialize." Hart nodded. "We've built the chain from locker to shop. Now we'll tie shop to van to jacket to hall to door. Then we make the room do the last bit of work. Show the path can be walked in the time the tower says." The ADA reviewed the packet and signed the next page without commentary. A search for Adler's apartment narrowed to garments, shoes, and any storage for cases. They found a pair of trainers with dust in the tread that glowed under ALS like foam binder and brass filings married. Lab called it consistent, of course. Consistency had become the day's music. They also found a notebook on a kitchen counter with rigging diagrams and a list that read mag, wedge, LED slam, meter, catcher, cap. The defense would call it a shopping list for a demonstration. The prosecution would call it a rehearsal note. Hart bagged it because words on paper like to be read under oath. By evening, the file had a skeleton you could hang a closing on. Locker ID from digits in a song case with catcher/meter/receipt sticker serial in shop ledger prepaid card purchase minutes after shop close depositor on camera with cap and seam tower ping at locker tower near canal yard in the window magnet scoring on fire door latch wedge with grinder compound corridor brass filings van with foam depression and jacket with foam dust and rosin mesh offcut that married the catcher's run. Cuff with nick that matched the catcher. Impression calibration sticker fiber that matched the shop's towel roll. No one piece would stand alone on a blown day. Together, they stopped being a story and became a structure. Tomorrow morning, Hart said to Ward, we run the path on camera end to end. Magnet, wedge, lights, blank, catcher. 65 seconds on the clock. We'll put it next to the tower hop and the breaker log. Then we pick him up. Ward scratched his jaw with a capped pen. You want to arrest tonight? I want to arrest when the room and the row sing the same pitch, Hart said. And when the chain has cooled enough not to smear. She wrote the night memo for the morning team. Bring the duplicate magnet, the training slide with mesh, the sound meter, the dummy pelican. Set the cameras at the angles the jurors would sit at in their minds. Measure from the door wedge to the bench to the panel and back. Tag the raking light photos with the plan sets are 3-box inset. Print the kiosk still with the gum wrapper. Keep the jacket's cuff for the foam testimony, not for drama. Hart stopped at the lab doorway on the way out and looked, one more time, at the Pelican foam's tiny ridges, at the mesh ladders run, at the calibration stickers slashed fiber. The day had been a list. Lists win trials. Tomorrow would be theater, a timed walk through a room that had been taught to talk. With the chain sealed from locker to Adler's tools to his van and clothes, Hart booked the reconstruction for first light, ride the magnet, trip the lights, fire a blank into foam, make the path in 65 seconds, and called the ADA, probable cause firm, arrest in the wind. They took Canal Yard at first light, the way you take a stage when you mean to prove the show can be done with nothing up the sleeve. Hart kept the crew small. Ward, the reconstruction sergeant, a ballistics tech with blanks and a training slide fitted with a mesh catcher, a property officer with a duplicate Pelican case, and a building engineer to watch the breaker like a priest at the altar, ready when called. The fire door still wore its magnet scars like whiskers. Hart had the sergeant chalk a rectangle on the landing where Renee had found the wedge, then set a fresh rubber wedge at the head of the chalk and photographed it with the plan sheets UMR R3 inset in the corner. The ADA had asked for pictures a juror could understand in 3 seconds. Hart planned to give them 2. Clock starts at the trip, Hart said. But first, we ride the door. Property handed over the duplicate magnet. A Gauss block with a leather strap that looked like a trick and worked like one. Hart slid the strap over her wrist, pressed the magnet to the latch face, and felt the plate jump to attention. She depressed the panic bar with a shoulder and eased the door open. The magnet kept the latch tongue from seating. The alarm contact stayed fooled. The sergeant filmed her hands close, then pulled back for the wide. The video editor would want both. Document the scoring, Hart said. The tech raked light across the latch. Fresh lines rose in parallel. The camera saw what human eyes always pretended to miss until shown. Inside, the corridor lay in its morning hush. Carpet seemed straight. The felt deadening sound with its day face. Hart placed the training slide's muzzle toward the foam inside Studio A, a meter from the bench. The catcher's mesh bag hung like a collapsed lung at the ejection port. Every spent casing that would have arced instead would be swallowed. The ballistics tech checked the blank, gave Hart the nod. The sound meter, an identical consumer model to the one in evidence, hung from a hook in the corridor with its mic pointed at nothing in particular. On my mark, Hart said to the engineer at the subpanel. 3 work lights on 1 circuit. The engineer flipped 3 toggles at once. The cheap LEDs slammed awake. The panel hiccuped exactly the way last night's log had hiccuped. A relay clicked and tripped. The corridor fluorescence died. The studio lamp snuffed. The emergency lights came up, dirty and late the way emergency lights always come up. Ward hit the stopwatch. Hart moved. The camera caught her back as she crossed the threshold into Studio A, set the wedge with her toe, and went to the piano bench. Her shoulder brushed the dust cover's treble corner, lifting it a hair. Price would later say not to overplay that in court. Humans bump things. Hart planted her feet the way a shooter who knows rooms plants them, raised the training slide, and fired a blank into the acoustic panel where the angle would take a bullet if one could. The bang in the room was a clap, small by design. Out in the corridor, the meter's line spiked, not to gunshot, but to what Renee had called a book falling. Hart racked the slide as if it mattered, the catcher shivering, the mesh bag doing what it is paid to do. Catching nothing in our case, but demonstrating how it would catch. She turned, holstered the blank, and moved back to the door. Hook slid the wedge with her shoe so it popped out in a small arc, and palmed the magnet off the latch with a twist that left the scoring you could see under light later. She let the door settle and took the corridor in 5 long strides. Her right knee telegraphing the tiniest lag on push-off because her body remembered ladder runs from a decade ago in someone else's house. Ward stopped the watch outside in the crisp air. 64.8, he read. The second run came 65 and a breath. The third, 65 flat. The tower hop on Adler's log had left a time mouth that swallowed them whole and asked for dessert. They ran it again for the camera's sake with the angles the jury would sit at in their heads. A wide from the corridor, a medium over the shoulder at the wedge, a close on the magnet riding the latch, a second on the meter screen when the blank went off. The ballistics tech swapped the blank for an inert snap cap and fired again for silence comparison. The meter barely hiccuped. They took a third pass with the room lights left on to show the difference the breaker made in visibility and sound. Each time, the stopwatch read in the mid-60s, and Hart felt the strange relief that comes when reality agrees to follow a plan. After, the lab put the corridor meter squiggle next to Renee's hallway recording. The spike shapes were siblings, bookfall amplitude, not gunshot. The meter and the witness would sing harmony about that in front of 12 people who did not want to be there and would hate themselves for leaning forward anyway. Angle of incidence on the panel? Hart asked the ballistics tech, pointing at the shallow bite in the foam where the real bullet had gone. The tech ran a laser through a dowel placed along the furrow, found the line back to where a head would have been if the shooter had stood where Hart had stood. The green dot sat a handspan left of the bench. Close range, shallow rake, clean exit into foam. If they ever excavated the bullet someone else had fired last night, it would be a mushroom that told no brand and no story we needed. Casings had been the story and casings were gone. That was why human beings make bags. The engineer reset the breaker and showed Hart the panel's log again. See the load curve, he said, tapping. These LED bricks are cheap. They're inrush spikes exactly like this when you throw them all at once. Whoever did it knew this panel, or knew panels, or rehearsed, Hart said. She sent Ward to pull Warehouse 12 CCTV from 2128 onward. The hop map needed its ending. He returned with a split screen. Adler passing the side stage camera 2 minutes before the post-trip time window closed. Cap off, no reflective seam this time. Expression set to the neutrality of a man choosing not to notice the world. A house tech stood beside him, oblivious. Hart paused the frame where the right knee telegraphed its soft complaint, stepping up to the riser. Make a copy for the deck, she said. Renee will narrate that knee without meaning to. They had one more piece of theater to record. Hart set a high-vis jacket with a reflective seam on a rolling rack at the corridor bend where Renee said he'd seen the runner's back. She stood Renee there with a camera off to one side and a light down the hall at a shallow angle. When the jacket turned, the stripe caught the light and flashed ugly, the exact memory he'd stammered the first night. That seam, he said, without looking at Hart. That seam. She did not ask him for more than that on camera. She would not lose it to embroidery. In the lab, the Pelican foam cell print and the sliver from Adler's flight case looked like their own weird microcartography under the microscope. The expert would say consistent with the same mold series, and the jury would believe that meant same foam. even if the judge reminded them it did not. Hart would let the judge do the reminding. Her job was the bridge between. She took the chalked wedge from the landing and put it on a bench beside the shop grinder compound and the graphite packet, both from Adler's bin. Under a scope, the microspheres of abrasive, the carbon flakes, the minor contaminants matched like dialects from the same county. The trace chemist did not smile when she signed the report, but she did breathe like a runner allowed a slower pace. Price hovered in the lab doorway, a spectator at her own opera. "Your 65 seconds did what it needed," she said. "Now we're out of clever and into furniture." "Good," Hart said. "Furniture wins juries." They booked a final pass with the ADA, the packet ready for probable cause made heavy, then checked one more box that would matter when a defense wanted to pretend the row was art doodled into meaning by cops with time. Hart asked Alice for a demonstration that didn't involve Alice at all. Price had a graduate student who could read a row like a shopping list. Under Hart's instruction, the student took a fresh copy of the prime row and, with Price watching, reproduced the digit mapping, the interval letters, and the dynamics groups into UMR without knowing the suspect list, the locker numbers, or the grid. The result landed in the same 6 and 3 block, the same 5-letter head, the same R3. They filmed it. A methodology must not require faith. The last hour before the arrest Hart spent on small mercies. She called the public works engineer and had him record a 30-second video pointing to the R3 label on the plan, describing UMR in words an ant could understand. She called property and had the magnet scrubbed clean of prints again and bagged with a fresh seal because she did not want a defense to feast on the imaginary smudge of a tech's finger. She called the coroner and confirmed, one more time, the TOD window. The coroner sighed and blessed her with the bureaucratic certainty of 2114 to 2118 on the sheet. Then she wrote the arrest memo in sentences that felt like they could hold their own weight. Probable cause based on chain of custody from witness artifact to physical exhibits. Convergence across independent systems. Reconstruction demonstrating mechanical plausibility and temporal fit. Identification evidence from route reference and silhouette features. Corroboration from telecom. Ward came in with the last piece of paper from the kiosk. A sales log for prepaid cards that timestamped the 1941 purchase and showed the batch number printed on the card sleeve. The transit system's locker system had logged the same batch number keying open the unit at 1954. The circle closed with a click you could hear if you were the kind of person who liked to hear things close. "Time?" Ward asked. "Now," Hart said. "We take him quiet." They took Adler at his shop, not for spectacle but for chain. He stood at the counter with a spool of solder and a look that suggested he'd expected a day like this in most of his futures. Hart read the charge in the voice she saved for reading charges: murder, possession of an unlicensed suppressor device. If a brass catcher could be made to fit the statute, the ADA would argue it was paraphernalia, not a suppressor. Hart didn't care if it fell off later, and associated entries for tampering with alarms. She cuffed him front because he had not made them chase. "You solved it with a crossword," Adler said, as if granting her a point in a debate. "No," Hart said. "We solved it with a locker, a sticker, a jacket, a knee, a wedge, a breaker, a door. The crossword just told us where to knock." He watched her for the half-second he used to assess whether to be angry or superior and chose superior, because anger has upkeep. "You'll have to make the music make sense to people who cannot hear," he said. "That's why we filmed furniture," Hart said. They walked him out past the racks of careful equipment and the clerk who had survival in her eyes but also something like relief. The small relief of a woman who will not have to carry someone else's secrets down a flight of stairs anymore. Back at the squad, Hart laid the morning's footage next to the station stills, the tower pings, the plan sheet, the foam micrographs. The box looked sturdy. Boxes like that keep men. She sent the ADA the link to the reconstruction cut and the list of witnesses. Price on methodology, the engineer on UMR, the trace chemist on mesh and foam, the gate analyst, the transit custodian, the kiosk owner who sold ignorance, Renee with his seam and his small shame, and Alice not to speak but to play the row once and then look at her hands like the night of. Price came by as they were packing up for the press whisper. "You're going to let the row be a piece and not the whole," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to let the room carry most of it," Hart said. "The row will go where hearsay can't. It will name a locker without being a mouth, and it will draw a square on a map with its own fingers." "And the intervals?" Price asked. "Intervals will lay a name on the table," Hart said. And then the receipts will sit on top of it until it doesn't move. She shut the case files binder with a satisfying two-hand clap and slid it into the stack that meant we're done for now. Outside, the canal's water had the color of polished lead. In Studio B, the upright would sit quiet until the city needed another testimony in a language kinder than the mouth. With the reconstruction on tape, magnet, wedge, breaker trip, blank into foam, 65 seconds end to end, and the timeline stitched to tower pings, Hart scheduled a session with Alice to translate sight into identification on the keyboard itself, the last step before she handed the box to a jury. The last piece Hart needed from Alice was something the law could call identification without calling it suggestion. No words in Alice's throat, no nodding at photographs, no fishing for yes. If the girl could turn a silhouette into music, Hart would give the room a way to hear what she had seen. Price designed the session like a small lab experiment. The victim liaison, not Hart, brought Alice in and sat with her. Price handled all instructions. Hart watched through glass with a legal pad she didn't write on. A camera recorded from a neutral angle. Everything that could look like prompting was taken apart and set behind a line. On the table, 8 work jackets with high-visibility shoulder seams, photographed under the same raking light and printed at the same size. The array included 3 models sold within a 5-block radius of Adler's shop and 5 others bought from a municipal surplus store to muddy any brand familiarity. Separately, on a rolling rack behind a screen, hung the actual jacket taken from Adler's van along with 7 decoys purchased overnight in sizes that kept the shoulder proportions believable. No faces, no bodies. Price placed a laminated sheet on the piano stand. On it, a legend. Low notes equals darker areas. High notes equals reflective stripes. White keys only. 1 chord per slice from head to waist. Play slices in order left to right. Beneath, a second legend for deliberate gaps. Rests. To indicate missing features. Hat. Hood. Alice, Price said, keeping her voice even and her hands still. You told us what you saw with a row. We'll ask for a different way to tell it. For each picture, play a short sketch, not a tune, using this mapping. Start at the shoulders and give us 3 slices, shoulder line, upper back, mid-back. Use white keys only, and place the reflective stripes high on the keyboard. If there's a cap or hood, leave a small rest before the first chord. If the stripe breaks anywhere, clip the top note, as if it were missing a tooth. Alice read the legend as if it were a page of scales. She nodded once, placed her hands over the keys, and waited. Price stood behind an upright cardboard shield and, without showing Alice, shuffled a stack of numbered cards that corresponded to the 8 photographs. She held up the first card to the camera, slid the first photo forward on the table, and said, "Sketch 1." Alice did not look toward the glass. She looked at the photo, then at the keys. She pressed a compact, clustered chord low mid-high, the top note brittle, clipped a hair short. Then a second slice with the top note higher, the low note barely altered. Third slice, a lower pair without the top. She let her hand hover for half a beat at the start, a tiny rest that the DAW wrote down as a silence of 210 milliseconds. Price said, "Sketch 2, and changed the photo. The chords came different now. The top notes in the first 2 slices closer together, the bottom carrying a slight climb as if a seam angled. No rest, no clipped top notes. The DAW logged the vertical spacing and the envelope of each chord. The labels on the screen stayed resolutely nonverbal. By the 4th sketch, a pattern was emerging. When the photo showed a single unbroken stripe, Alice's top notes in the first 2 slices landed as the same pitch. When the stripe ran across both shoulders, she made the top interval wider to a third. When the stripe kinked over a yoke seam, the second slice's top note dropped a step as if to mirror the bend. Twice, when the stock photo showed a hood obscuring the shoulder line, she left the initial rest. When a jacket had no stripe at all, she pushed the top note down into the middle register and leaned weight into the low, a blunt signal of dark. Price shuffled the last 3 cards with her eyes closed to please the future cross-examiner. Sketch 7 elicited the same opening rest as Sketch 1. Then a top note clipped like a chipped tooth. Sketch 8, no rest, a level top pair, low note steady. In the next room, Hart didn't trust the warmth she felt. She was counting, not rooting. When the stack emptied, Price nodded to the tech. He exported the sketches as MIDI, stripped the audio and names, and sent the event lists to a small script he and Price had written overnight. The script did arithmetic any first-year theory student would bless. For each sketch, it read the vertical spacing of the 3 slices' top notes and coded 1, if slice 1's top matched slice 2's, 2, if they didn't. It coded K, if the second slice's top fell a step, a kink, C, if any top note was clipped within a tolerance. It read the presence of a rest at the head as H, headgear. It read the low note's contour across slices as S+, if it climbed, suggesting an angled seam, S equals if it held. It spitted out little strings like H, C, K, S equals that meant nothing but matched a legend the lab had already built for the 8 photos based on measurements in pixels and a sewing guide's knowledge of cheap reflective tape. The mapping called Photo 4, a 2-piece stripe with a yoke kink, as C, K, S equals. Alice's sketch 7 gave H, C, K, S equals, the same plus a head rest. Price walked around the partition and, without celebration, marked a plain X on a grid beside those entries. The tally grew. Of 8 photos, Alice's sketches best matched Photo 4, Photo 1, and Photo 6 with clear first-choice scores. Photo 4 led. Only then did Price roll out the rack of actual jackets. Alice would not be asked to point. The same mapping applied, this time looking at hanging garments in real light from the corridor. No labels, no smells, no suspects, just 8 backs under a lamp at a low angle. The graduate student, blind to the case, recorded the sketches this time while Price shuffled positions behind the screen and held up new numbers to the camera. Sketches came. Rests present for 2, top note clips on 3, low note climbs on 2. Parsed, the best match was jacket 3. When the tag hidden in the sleeve were read after the last chord faded, jacket 3 was the one from Adler's van. Hart let the pen in her hand move once across the blank paper. It left a line she'd remember and tear out later. They didn't stop there. Price had one more ask written into the protocol to catch the last contour Alice had described with her hands in the first interview. A faint reflective pip on the right shoulder seam, where the tape had wrinkled around a stitch and reflected unusually. In the garment lineup, only one jacket had that imperfection. Price gave Alice a new legend. If you see a small extra glint on the right, play a grace note above the top pitch in the second slice only. If not, don't. On jacket 3, Alice flicked the grace note. The DAW caught it. The tech drew a red circle on the photograph after the session to show the wrinkle. Under loop, the reflective tape's microbads at that stitch showed a tiny scrape, the kind you get when 2 layers are pressed and flexed over time. In the van, the same tape had flaked a grain of that reflective filler. The lab had bagged it and read its index under FTIR. You couldn't swear it was the same jacket. You could tell the story of one jacket that had aged the same way. Price closed the laptop. Last thing, she said softly. If you have it in you, a short row to mark the place where the person disappeared. 2 clusters only if you can. Same language. Alice put her right hand over the keys and played 5 notes. No repeats, then another 3. The second note and the fourth were accented. Price jotted the intervals almost on reflex, then did the math while the room remembered to breathe. The interval letters said L3. Alice added a 2-note cadence, short, long, then a rest that fell like a step down. Price circled the letters and wrote S beside them for stare. The Morse at the end, asterisk asterisk dot dash asterisk asterisk, could be an A or just an ending. Price opted not to sell it beyond what it could hold. Hart moved into the room and stood at the doorway, far enough not to feel like weather. Alice, she said, you've done enough for a week, but I have one question you can answer by looking at the paper. She slid a simple sheet forward with 2 lines on it. Level 3 stare and level 2 stare. If the place you saw him last had a number, which line is closer? Alice put a finger on level 3 stare and held it there long enough to satisfy a camera. Ward, who hated theater and loved results, called an hour later from the lab with the rosin result Hart had expected and not permitted herself to pre-celebrate. Cuff trace and Studio A panel dust share profile, he said. Same resin type and plasticizer. Not unique. Violin rooms shed the same snow, but it lines up. Good, Hart said. Rosin is background. The seam is foreground. The sketch is the bridge. By late afternoon, the packet had gained a clean identification section that did not ask a child to point at a man. Non-suggestive musical encoding of garment features matched to a photograph array and a blind garment lineup. Distinctive seam kink and reflective wrinkle signaled by grace note. Corroboration by trace rosin on cuff. Secondary encoded row yielding. L3S consistent with the level 3 stair landing where the wedge was found. The ADA, who had less poetry than Hart and more. Patience for repetition. Underlined non-suggestive twice. Hart stepped out onto the narrow balcony that looked over the canal and allowed herself 5 seconds of ugly air. Below, a tour boat cut the water into diagrams that healed as soon as it passed. Upstairs, the room had learned a new way to take testimony. Downstairs, a woman behind a kiosk would remember a man buying a card with cash and not counting his change. Somewhere in between, a jacket had flashed ugly when it turned a corner. Next, Hart said to the rail, we go to court and make furniture talk. The courtroom had the acoustics of a place that believed sound should carry guilt in it. The ceiling gave voices a softened brightness. 12 people in the box arranged their faces into the expression you wear when you have promised to attend to other people's problems. Hart sat second chair beside the ADA and wrote only as much as the ritual demanded. On the other side, Carl Adler picked an angle for his chin and kept it. His lawyer, a man who could turn questions into refinements of themselves, set out 3 pens perfectly parallel and did not smile. The ADA opened in a voice calibrated for jurors who had decided the morning would be long. He promised them nothing that couldn't be held in a hand or pointed to on a board. This case is about a path, he said. A door that never alarmed. A breaker that tripped at 9:17 p.m. A locker opened at 7:54. Pelican case. A jacket with a stripe that flashes ugly. The defendant who rehearsed safety until it became the opposite. And one more thing. A witness who could not speak and told us what she saw in music. He didn't say Schoenberg. He said music the way people do when they mean both art and arithmetic. Hart took a breath and let it out uncounted. Dr. Helena Price went first, not because jurors love professors, but because the court had scheduled the public works engineer to test a manhole in the afternoon and Price could be depended upon to finish a thought on time. She established her credentials without allowing herself footnotes. Then she told the story of the row the way she told it in the lab. Alice provided a sequence of 12 tones, each a different pitch class, with no repetitions, what in my field is called a prime row, she said. Under controlled conditions, she reproduced the exact order and the same 3 accent positions across takes and transpositions. We treated her statement as a structured artifact with 3 measurable properties: pitch identity, interval steps, and dynamics and phrasing. The ADA had her draw the clock face and the mapping on a big foam board and, for the benefit of the gallery and the record, on the document camera. She laid out C equals 0 through B equals 11. Pitch to digit, she said, with accent positions serving as separators, yielded a 6-digit block and a 3-digit block. The 6 matched an active parcel locker. The 3 matched the locker line. Independently, mapping interval steps to letters, A equals 1 through Z equals 26. The first 5 steps spelled A, D, L, E, R, and interpreting the 3 repeated dynamic clusters as Morse length groupings, shorts and longs, gave you M, R, letters used in the city's urban map reference grid. At the prevailing tempo, 84 beats per minute, the accent positions align with the established time of death window. She did not oversell. When the ADA asked, "How likely is chance?" she slid a 1-page summary onto the document cam. In a Monte Carlo of 10,000 random rows, a 5-letter English surname at the head by pure chance is uncommon. The chance that the same row also encodes a valid, open locker in the same city and a grid reference to the crime's egress and a tempo aligning to the time of death window, lower by orders of magnitude. More to the point, these outcomes are independent because they rely on different properties of the same artifact. Defense stood for cross with the calm of a man about to try a violin for cracks by tapping it. "Professor, you like puzzles?" "I like testable structures," Price said. "You decided, after speaking to police, to see a name you already suspected. I did not have the suspect list when I performed the mapping, Price said. My emails and timestamps reflect that. The method is pre-specified and repeatable. You took a teenager's nervous performance and turned it into riddles. I measured consistent, repeatable accent positions and order under controlled conditions. The riddles are standard ciphers known to first-year theory students and engineers both. You are aware Morse can spell many things, Defense said. Yes. Here, the letters align with a pre-existing city system used to label the exact egress route. If your concern is pareidolia, independence across systems mitigates it. You enjoy Schoenberg? I enjoy juries who understand me, Price said, and sat back to let that land without looking pleased with herself. The public works engineer took the stand with a hard hat in the aisle for show and a plan set under his arm that smelled like toner. In words that could have fit on a post-it, he explained UMR. Urban map reference, grid overlays for engineering, letters for rows, numbers for columns. R3 is the block that includes Canal Yard's east egress stair. The plan sheet labels the alarm contact, R3 EES. He pointed on the blown-up diagram. The jurors' heads followed the finger. He did not speculate about music. He did not need to. Transit's custodian followed with the locker log. The 6-digit credential matched the unit opened at 1954 on line 3. The overhead still rolled. Cap, jacket, pelican, open, close. Gate analysis was introduced through a cautious expert who said precisely what he was paid to say and no more. The depositor favored his right knee on push-off. The pattern was consistent with a documented patellar strain in the defendant's history. Many men favor knees. This one did so in a way that resembled Mr. Adler's documented asymmetry. Then properties technician walked the court through the pelican under glass. The brass catcher, the sound level meter with the Adler acoustics calibration sticker dated 3 days prior, the nitrile gloves, the receipts, one for calibration, one for brass screen 200. The sticker ledger pages came next, the serial gap where cash, NO name lived. The judge allowed the pages under a business records exception and instructed the jury not to speculate about redacted client names. The kiosk owner, with the world-weary patience of a man who sells dreams that make people smaller, identified the timestamp sale of a prepaid card at 1941. The Z-reading printout matched the keying that opened the locker 13 minutes later. Ward narrated the reconstruction video like a man who hated theater but loved furniture. The magnet rode the latch on the big screen. The scoring lines glowed under raking light. The breaker tripped at the engineer's toggles. The corridor meter's spike, bookfall, not gunshot, drew itself. Hart crossed the room and back in 65 seconds. The jury clocks did not come out, but more than one hand moved, unconsciously tapping a rhythm. Trace testified as Trace does, with small words. Brass filings in the corridor carpets, mesh run matching an offcut from the shop, foam cell geometry, consistent with Adler's flight case. A rubber cuff ridge nick that made it a fragment in Adler's bin to the catcher's impression. A blue-white microfiber trapped under the calibration sticker that matched the shop's towel stock. None of it sang alone. Together they made harmony. The ADA stacked the little tent cards on the evidence table so the jury could see small next to small next to small until small looked like a wall. René Duval took the stand with his wrists showing and his apology put away. He said book falling again and the meter's graph nodded. He pointed to the jacket seam in a photograph, not to a man. That seam, he said. It flashed when he turned. The ADA did not ask him to say he again. The clinician came to explain Alice's silence. Selective mutism triggered by acute stress, not fantasy-prone personality. Prior school records noting performance anxiety. No indicators for malingering. He said one sentence the jury needed to hear. She chose the language available to her. At last, Alice. The ADA kept the ritual short. The defense had agreed to a stipulation. No face the man moment, no pointing, no predatory pauses. Price sat near the piano rolled to the well of the court, and the judge, who had made faces earlier when the word 12-tone entered the room, let the instrument in with a humorless quip about this being a first for Department 12. The ADA's questions were statements. You recorded a file titled Statement after you witnessed a person leaving, he said. Alice nodded. You can reproduce the order of notes consistently. Nod. You can reproduce the touches that are a little louder. Nod. You will now play the same 12 notes once. She did. The DAW overlay, already admitted, appeared on the screen with its 3 little peaks labeled not with letters but with numbers. 2, 7, 11. The jurors watched themselves lean forward. Price then conducted the keyboard sketch procedure exactly as in the lab. No suspect's jacket, only the photo array. The mapping legend, the 3 slices, the rests for headgear. The script's readouts, visible on the screen, coded the features. The best match landed on the photograph whose seam kink and tape clip matched the defendant's jacket family. Then the blind garment lineup, the rack behind the screen, ended with Jacket 3. The tag read Adler's make and size when revealed. No pointing, just chords, rests, a grace note where the right shoulder wrinkle lived, and then the camera freezing that grace note on a staff under the photograph with the red circled flake. Defense stood for cross with a tone that wanted to be gentle and landed as careful. "Alice," he said, and then realized he had to address her through Price. "Professor, the witness has been exposed to discussion of reflective seams since the night in question. She was not present for shop searches," Price said. "She saw photographs only at the controlled session. The mapping was pre-specified and applied blind by a graduate assistant. We filmed all shuffles. You gave her legends that told her what to find. I gave her a fixed translation from visual features to musical parameters to avoid verbal suggestion. The same legend applied to all 8 garments. You chose 8 because the department purchased 8 under budget and because lineups commonly use 6 to 8. If you prefer 12 for symmetry, we can do 12. The method scales." Defense let that hang, then turned back to Price proper. "Professor, you are aware that juries can be seduced by patterns. I am counting on them being convinced by independence," Price said. "Digits to lockers, intervals to a name, dynamics to a grid, tempo to a clock. None requires accepting the others. All are borne out by physical evidence you can hold." The ADA brought the chain home with Hart, briefly, to walk the path. Wedge, latch, breaker, 65 seconds, tower pings, station stills, the Pelican's contents, the sticker ledger hole, the kiosk sleeve log. Hart kept her answers inside the white lines. When defense asked her if this was the first time she'd solved a murder with a melody, she said, "It's the first time a melody led me to a locker," and the judge's mouth twitched before he remembered he wore a robe. Closing, the ADA didn't touch the word Schoenberg either. He said, "Believe the room." He put the Magnetscar photograph next to the panel log, next to the meter spike, next to the locker, still next to the receipts, next to the cuff's nick, next to the foam's print. And then believe that a witness told the truth in the only language her body trusted. If you are reluctant to convict on art, don't. Convict on metal and rubber and foam and the defendant's route through the dark. The notes just got us to the door. Defense's closing made the expected moves with expected grace. He called it cleverness. He called it coincidence. He showed the jurors the word consistent 6 times. Bolded. He trellised doubt where there was only structure and hoped vines would grow. The jury went out with a card of exhibits and a typed list of definitions the judge had written like flashcards. Interval, tempo, urban map reference, gate asymmetry. They had the reconstruction video. They had the locker still. They had the jacket photographs and the grace note staff. They did not have Schoenberg. They did not need him. Hart sat at counsel table and watched the room breathe in and out. She did not drum the row on the wood. She did not count to 11. She watched Alice, who watched her hands. She watched Adler, who watched Hart the way a man watches a clock he objects to. The verdict would come when it came. The box Hart had built felt square. The row had walked inside it without touching the sides. The jury asked for the metronome. The bailiff carried it in like a small animal, set it on the evidence cart, and left it still. They did not ask to hear the row again. They asked for the reconstruction and the locker stills and the plan sheet with our 3 circled in red like a school correction. They were out 5 hours, long enough for doubt to stretch and then find its limits. When they filed back, the room took a position, one of those physical changes a body makes when it wants an ending. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, read what the paper gave him. Guilty of murder. Guilty of tampering with a fire alarm device. The lesser counts, 2, like dust in the corners of a clean room. On guilty, Adler looked down, not at his lawyer, not at Hart, not at the world. A man who had spent a life measuring rooms had mismeasured one. In the hallway afterward, press voices stacked like harmonies they didn't mean to sing. The ADA said the kind of sentences prosecutors say, and said them with the relief of someone who believed in furniture. Hart said nothing. Price stood with her hands in her pockets and watched the elevator numbers change. Motive took shape the ordinary way when money comes out of hiding. Emails and contracts sealed until they weren't. Testimony from a rigging subcontractor who'd heard Adler talk about ruined prospects if Kincaid followed through on his threat to file safety complaints with venues. Adler had work to protect. Kincaid had leverage. A man rehearsed a way to keep revenue and keep silence. He chose a door and a breaker and a bag. Alice came in through a side entrance 2 days later to retrieve her phone. It sat in property in a clear box, tagged and initialed, a thing with its own small biography now. The clerk made her sign 3 times for it, then offered a sentence that came out wrong and kind, both. Alice nodded and turned the phone over once in her hands before she put it in her pocket like a stone. Price met her at the door. "Something for you," Price said, extending a small wrapped package. Alice unfolded the paper at a careful pace. Inside, a metronome, wood-grained plastic pretending to be a nicer wood, the pendulum shiny from a factory that made a lot of pendulums. On the base, an engraving plate, "Testify in any language." Alice touched the plate with one finger and looked at Price the way you look at a thing you have to grow into. Her mouth made a shape that might have been thank you in a season where it would be safe to say it. For now she nodded. It was enough. Hart walked the canal that evening because that was what the city had for endings. Water you could stand beside while it pretended not to move. The studios were quieter than they'd been since the night of. A handwritten note on the corkboard inside said the Grand in Studio A would be on loan to a conservatory while the room was deconsecrated. As if music left holy residue. She stood outside anyway, looking at the fire stair and the place on the landing where a small wedge had once made an easy exit and a hard story. Back at her desk, she filed the last of what the case wanted. The Pelican went back into a warehouse of closed things. The jacket was boxed with a photo of its seam taped to the lid. The magnet had its own bag like a pet, papers stacked in a sequence an auditor would love. She slid the statement file Alice had made into the digital archive and watched the progress bar move like a slow walk. The file name stayed the same. That was the point. Before she left, she stood in the doorway of Studio B and put her hand on the upright's closed fallboard. The room had learned 2 languages in a week. The one it had always had, of angles and filament hum and tape, and another where a girl could hold her breath and ask a row to point with authority. Hart lifted the fallboard and touched middle C with one finger and let it die. Then she played Alice's 12, quietly. It was not a song. It was a set of steps. When the last one fell away, nothing echoed. Rooms like this absorb noise and leave shape. She thought of the line Price liked, independent signals from the same artifact, and let it translate to her side of the street, for paths to the same door. Locker digits, interval letters, Morse on a grid, tempo on a clock. None required belief in the others. All took you to a hand on a latch. The rest was brass, foam, rubber, dust. The things that don't pretend to be more than they are. She closed the lid. The canal outside kept its slow arithmetic. Somewhere a train slid under a city and into a station where lockers let themselves be numbered because people like order even when they mean chaos. The case file on her desk had a red diagonal stamp she did not apply lightly. Closed. 12 notes had been enough. Not because they were magic or because the court had an appetite for novelty, but because they refused to become story and stayed facts. In a city of noise, you win when something doesn't echo. You write it down and you let it rest. When the last note fades, the case closes with it. 12 without echo was never about riddles for their own sake, but about how truth can hide in unexpected forms, on a door's scar, in a receipt's smear, or in 12 notes a frightened witness pressed into silence. Thank you for staying with us through every step of this investigation. Your time, your attention, and your trust are what allow Somnolent Conspiracies to keep searching the shadows where details hide. If you found yourself drawn into this story, Please remember to subscribe, tap the bell, and leave a like. It helps us more than you know, and it ensures you'll never miss the next case waiting in the dark. Until then, keep listening closely. Every silence has a shape, and every story leaves a trace.